the governess of Willow Creek Manor. The late summer sun, heavy and golden as spilled honey, slanted through the towering windows of Willow Creek Manor's east-facing drawing room, illuminating motes of dust dancing in the languid air with an almost hypnotic slowness. Outside, the vast Derbyshire estate stretched in a patchwork of emerald meadows dotted with drowsy sheep, dark copses whispering ancient secrets, and the distant, silver ribbon of the River Derwent winding its unhurried course towards the sea. It was a landscape of profound, unchanging peace, the kind that seeped into one's bones and encouraged quiet contemplation rather than excitement. Within the room, the silence was profound, broken only by the ponderous, rhythmic tick-tock of the mahogany longcase clock in the corner, a sound so deeply ingrained in the fabric of the house it felt like the measured heartbeat of the manor itself. Eleanor Thorne sat very straight on the edge of a damask-covered chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, the worn fabric of her gray traveling dress feeling coarse against her skin, a stark contrast to the room's understated opulence, the faded but exquisite Persian rug beneath her sensible boots, the portraits of stern-faced ancestors gazing impassively down from walls papered in a subtle floral design, the heavy velvet curtains pooling richly on the polished oak floor. She was waiting for Mrs. Penhaligon, the housekeeper, a figure of considerable local repute whose efficiency was spoken of in hushed, respectful tones throughout the county, and Eleanor felt a familiar flutter of nervousness low in her stomach, a sensation she sternly attributed to the journey and the unfamiliarity of her surroundings, not the daunting prospect of becoming governess to the children of the notoriously reserved Duke of Ashbourne. She focused her gaze on a particularly intricate pattern woven into the rug, tracing its sinuous curves with her eyes, finding a strange comfort in its predictable, unvarying repetition, a stark counterpoint to the unpredictable turns her own life had recently taken. The air smelled faintly of beeswax, lemon oil, dried lavender tucked discreetly into linen sachets within the drawers of the immense sideboard, and the lingering, ghostly trace of wood smoke from winters past, a comforting, domestic scent that spoke of generations of careful stewardship. Minutes stretched, measured solely by the clock's unwavering beat, and Eleanor allowed her mind to drift back to the small, bustling village school she had left behind, the cheerful chaos of children's voices now replaced by this profound, almost intimidating quiet, the weight of history pressing gently but insistently upon her. She wondered idly about the children she was to teach, Lady Amelia, aged 10, and Lord Henry, aged 7, their characters, their aptitudes, their willingness to accept instruction from a stranger. She hoped they would be quiet, studious, and appreciative of routine. She hoped fervently for routine. Finally, the heavy oak door swung open with a soft, well-oiled sigh, revealing Mrs. Penhaligon, a woman whose posture was as upright and unyielding as the manor's ancient chimneys, her steel-gray hair pulled back into a severe bun beneath a pristine white cap, her dark eyes missing nothing as they swept over Eleanor with an assessment that was swift, thorough, and entirely devoid of overt warmth, yet not unkind. "Miss Thorne," she stated, her voice crisp and clear, cutting through the silent room like a bell, "His Grace will see you now. Please follow me." Eleanor rose instantly, smoothing her skirts more out of habit than necessity, her heart giving a single, hard thump against her ribs before settling back into its accustomed, steady rhythm. She followed the housekeeper's rigid back through the cavernous, echoing entrance hall, its black and white marble floor gleaming coldly, past suits of armor standing sentinel in shadowed alcoves, beneath a soaring ceiling where a vast, dusty chandelier hung like a frozen constellation of crystal tears. They turned down a corridor lined with more ancestral portraits, the painted eyes seeming to follow their progress with detached interest, the air growing slightly cooler, damper. Mrs. Penhaligon stopped before a heavy door of dark oak, deeply carved with intertwined leaves and acorns, knocked once, sharply, and at a muffled sound from within, opened it, standing aside to allow Eleanor entrance. "Miss Eleanor Thorne, Your Grace," she announced, her tone perfectly modulated, before withdrawing, closing the door with a soft, definitive click that left Eleanor standing alone just inside the threshold of the Duke of Ashbourne's study. The room was large, dominated by an enormous desk piled with ledgers and correspondence, the walls lined floor to ceiling with books whose leather bindings exhaled the scent of old paper and wisdom. A fire crackled low but steadily in the grate despite the season, casting flickering shadows that danced over the worn leather of armchairs and the rich hues of a large, framed map of the estate on one wall. Behind the desk, silhouetted against the tall window that offered a view of the formal gardens, geometrically precise parterres filled with late-blooming roses and lavender, drowsing bees hovering over them, sat the Duke. He looked up from the document he had been perusing, his gaze meeting Eleanor's. He was younger than she had expected, perhaps in his mid-30s, though lines of care or perhaps simply habitual gravity were etched lightly around his eyes and mouth. His hair was dark, thick, and slightly unruly, as if resisting the discipline of a comb, and his eyes, a deep, serious brown, held an intensity that was momentarily unsettling, a sharp intelligence assessing her with the same detached scrutiny Mrs. Penhaligon had employed, yet somehow deeper, more penetrating. He wore no coat, his waistcoat of sober dark green wool unbuttoned, his shirt sleeves rolled up carelessly to the elbows, revealing strong forearms dusted with dark hair, an unexpected informality in such a setting. For a long moment, the only sounds were the gentle hiss and pop of the fire and the distant, mournful cry of a wood pigeon from the gardens. Eleanor dropped into a low, respectful curtsy, lowering her gaze to the intricate pattern of the Axminster rug beneath her feet, focusing on the deep blues and reds woven into its dense pile, waiting for him to speak, her earlier nervousness returning in a quiet wave, yet tempered by a sudden, sharp awareness of the man before her, an awareness that felt entirely inappropriate and which she firmly pushed aside, concentrating instead on the precise number of roses she could count in the rug's central medallion. Miss Thorne, his voice was deep, resonant, carrying easily across the room without being loud, a voice accustomed to command yet lacking any harshness. Thank you for coming. Please, sit. He gestured towards a sturdy leather armchair positioned across the desk from him. She straightened and moved forward, the soft soles of her boots making no sound on the thick rug, taking the offered seat, perching on the very edge, her back rigidly straight, hands once again clasped tightly in her lap. He studied her for another moment, his expression unreadable, before glancing down at a sheet of paper before him, her references, she assumed, meticulously provided by the agency in London. Your credentials appear satisfactory, he began, his tone matter of fact. Mrs. Wickham, at the agency speaks highly of your diligence and patience, qualities I value highly, particularly concerning Henry. My son is spirited. He paused, steepling his fingers before him, his gaze drifting momentarily towards the window, towards the ordered serenity of the gardens. Amelia is more studious, though prone to quiet daydreams. Your role will be to provide a solid foundation in the usual subjects: French, history, geography, arithmetic, drawing. Music, if you are proficient. Decorum, naturally. I expect regularity, discipline, and above all, quiet application. This is a house of order, Miss Thorne. His eyes returned to hers, holding her gaze with that unnerving directness. Do you believe you can provide that? Eleanor met his gaze steadily, though she felt a tremor inside. Yes, Your Grace, she replied, her voice clear and surprisingly calm in the quiet room. I believe I can. I understand the importance of routine and quiet study for a child's development. She paused, choosing her words carefully. May I inquire about the children's current routine? And their previous governess? A flicker of something, weariness, regret, passed over his features so quickly she might have imagined it. Miss Havisham left our employ rather suddenly 3 months ago, he stated, his voice devoid of inflection. Personal reasons. Since then, their instruction has been intermittent. Mrs. Penhaligon and the nurse have overseen them as best they could. Their routine has lapsed. You will find your chambers prepared adjoining the schoolroom on the 2nd floor. You will take breakfast with the children at 8, lessons commence at 9. Luncheon is at 1, followed by outdoor exercise or quiet pursuits depending on the weather. Lessons resume at 3 until 5. Dinner for the children is at 6. You will dine with Mrs. Penhaligon and myself in the small dining room at 7:30, unless otherwise informed. Sundays are reserved for church and rest. Does this suit? The schedule was precise, predictable, exactly the kind of structure Eleanor craved. Perfectly, Your Grace, she affirmed. And the children, are they expecting me? They have been informed, he said simply. He leaned back slightly in his chair, the leather creaking softly, his gaze sweeping over her once more, taking in her plain dress, her neatly pinned dark hair, her expression of composed attentiveness. Willow Creek is isolated, Miss Thorne. The nearest village is 3 miles distant. Society here is limited. I trust you are prepared for a degree of solitude. I am accustomed to quiet reflection, Your Grace, Eleanor replied honestly. My previous position was in a small village. I find solitude conducive to focus. He gave a single, brief nod, seemingly satisfied. Very well, Mrs. Penhaligon will show you to the schoolroom and your quarters. You may meet the children after they have taken their afternoon air. I trust you will establish the necessary order swiftly. It was a clear dismissal, delivered with the same quiet authority. Eleanor rose and curtsied again. "Thank you, Your Grace. I shall endeavor to meet your expectations." He had already returned his attention to the document on his desk, giving another absent nod. "See that you do, Miss Thorne." Eleanor turned and walked towards the door, her footsteps silent on the rug, acutely aware of his presence behind her, a tangible force in the quiet room. As she reached for the brass handle, cool and smooth beneath her fingers, she felt the weight of his gaze lift. She opened the door and stepped back into the corridor, finding Mrs. Penhaligon waiting patiently a few yards away, her expression as inscrutable as ever. The door closed softly behind her, sealing away the Duke and the quiet intensity of his study. "This way, Miss Thorne," the housekeeper said, turning without preamble and leading her back through the maze of corridors, up a broad, curving staircase with an ornately carved balustrade polished to a deep gleam by generations of hands, towards the second floor and the beginning of her new, deliberately uneventful life at Willow Creek Manor, a life that promised, above all else, the profound, sleep-inducing tranquility of unchanging routine and quiet days measured by the ticking of the longcase clock far below. The corridor upstairs was narrower, carpeted in a faded but serviceable runner, doors leading off at intervals. Mrs. Penhaligon stopped before one, opening it to reveal a spacious, sunlit room, the schoolroom. Large windows looked out over the stable yard and beyond to the rolling parkland. Desks stood in neat rows, a large blackboard dominated one wall, bookshelves groaned under the weight of primers, atlases, and volumes of improving literature. The air smelled of chalk dust, old paper, and faintly, of beeswax. Adjoining it, through another door, was a smaller, comfortably furnished sitting room with a writing desk and shelves, and beyond that, a simply appointed but clean and bright bedroom for Eleanor, complete with a washstand and a view over a quieter part of the garden towards the kitchen gardens. Her modest trunk had already been brought up and placed at the foot of the bed. "The children are currently in the south garden with Nurse Briggs," Mrs. Penhaligon informed her. "They will be brought up at 4 o'clock. You have an hour to settle in. Tea will be brought to you here at 4:30. Dinner at 7:30, as His Grace stated. The bell pull there," she indicated a woven cord near the fireplace in the sitting room, "connects to the servants' hall. Ring if you require anything." She paused, her sharp eyes taking in the room and Eleanor's quiet presence. "Welcome to Willow Creek, Miss Thorne. I trust you will find everything in order." With another efficient nod, she departed, leaving Eleanor alone in the quiet suite of rooms. Eleanor walked slowly to the window in her bedroom, gazing out at the orderly rows of vegetables and herbs, the neat paths, the brick walls covered in ripening fruit trees. The sheer, predictable quiet of the place was almost a physical presence. She unpacked her few belongings methodically, hanging her dresses in the wardrobe, placing her books on the shelf above the desk, arranging her hairbrush and comb on the washstand. Each action was deliberate, calming. She sat at the desk in the sitting room, pulling out a sheet of paper and a pen. She would draft a preliminary lesson plan, something structured, sensible, and utterly devoid of surprises. French verbs, English grammar, the kings and queens of England in chronological order, the principal rivers of Europe, simple arithmetic problems. Solid, unshakable facts. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked softly, companionably. Outside, the light began to soften, the golden haze deepening towards amber. Somewhere, distantly, she heard the faint, happy shout of a child, quickly hushed. She dipped her pen in the inkwell, the scratch of the nib on the paper the only sound in her peaceful, solitary world, the world of Eleanor Thorne, governess, where excitement was a foreign concept and the gentle monotony of the days stretched ahead, as long and uneventful as the Derwent flowing silently towards the sea, a perfect lullaby woven from routine and quietude. She wrote steadily, filling the page with neat, precise script outlining the week's predictable lessons, the rhythmic motion of her hand and the quiet focus a soothing counterpoint to the faint, fading sounds from the garden below, the scent of lavender from a sachet placed in a drawer by. Unseen hands mingling with the ink and old paper, wrapping her in the deep, drowsy embrace of Willow Creek Manor. The anticipation of meeting the children was a small, manageable ripple on this vast sea of calm, a necessary step into the established rhythm she was here to maintain and reinforce. She would be firm, kind, and above all, consistent. There would be no outbursts, no dramas, only the steady progression of knowledge and decorum, day following identical day in a comforting, somnolent procession. The wood pigeon called again, its mournful cry now a familiar part of the afternoon's tapestry, as Eleanor continued to write, the words flowing as steadily and predictably as the river beyond the park, each sentence a brick in the wall of quiet, uneventful security she was building around her new life, a life designed, above all else, to be profoundly, blessedly boring. Chapter 2, The Geometry of Quiet Afternoons. The heavy tread of Mrs. Penhaligon's sensible shoes faded down the corridor, swallowed by the thick silence of the second floor, leaving Eleanor alone in the sun-drenched schoolroom where dust motes, disturbed by their entrance, continued their languid dance in the golden shafts of late afternoon light slanting through the tall windows overlooking the stable yard. The air here was different from the drawing room below, less imbued with the weight of history and more with the practical scent of chalk, dry paper, and the faint, clean tang of the beeswax used to polish the wide floorboards around the edges of the well-worn rug defining the teaching area. Eleanor moved slowly, her own footsteps hushed on the rug, her gaze taking in the details. The two small, sturdy desks facing the larger teacher's desk and the imposing blackboard, the bookshelves crammed with primers titled The Child's Guide to Knowledge and Mangnall's Historical Questions, their spines cracked with use, a globe, slightly dusty, standing sentinel in one corner, a framed sampler exhorting diligence and obedience, hanging slightly askew near the door leading to her private sitting room. It was a space designed for purpose, devoid of frivolity, yet flooded with a calm, predictable light that felt reassuring. She crossed to the window, looking down into the stable yard below where a groom was quietly brushing the gleaming flank of a massive bay hunter, the rhythmic swish-swish of the bristles audible even at this height, a sound as steadying as the distant ticking of the house clock. Beyond the yard, the parkland rolled away, dotted with ancient oaks casting long, serene shadows in the declining sun, a landscape painted in muted greens and golds, utterly still save for the occasional flicker of a bird winging its way homeward. Turning back, Eleanor methodically explored her adjoining quarters, the sitting room, simply furnished with a worn but comfortable armchair near the small fireplace, a writing desk positioned to catch the light, and shelves already partially filled with improving literature, and finally, her bedroom, where her trunk sat patiently at the foot of a narrow, neatly made bed covered in a plain white counterpane, a washstand with a blue and white jug and basin, and a wardrobe that smelled faintly of cedar. Unpacking became a ritual of establishing order, each garment, each book, each small personal item, a miniature portrait of her late mother, a small box containing hairpins, her well-thumbed copy of the governess's manual was placed with deliberate care, transforming the unfamiliar space into a semblance of her own, predictable domain. The act was soothing, a tangible reinforcement of the routine she craved. Once finished, she returned to the sitting room desk, sat down, dipped her pen, and began drafting her lesson plan in neat, precise script. Monday, arithmetic, long division, English grammar, parsing sentences, geography, principal rivers of England, French, present tense of asterisk, etc. and avoir. Tuesday, history, King Alfred and the Danes, drawing, basic perspective, music, solfa scales, needlework, hemming, stitch. Wednesday, repetition and recitation of Tuesday's lessons, scripture, parable of the sower, natural philosophy, properties of air, and so on, filling the week with a grid of unvarying, intellectually nourishing, and profoundly unexciting activities designed to occupy young minds without stimulating undue fervor. The scratch of the nib was the only sound, a metronome marking the passage of this quiet hour. Precisely at 4 o'clock, a soft knock sounded at the schoolroom door, followed by the entrance of a plump, rosy-cheeked woman in a starched apron and cap, leading 2 children by the hand. "Miss Thorne," the woman said with a kind, slightly breathless smile, "I'm Nurse Briggs. This is Lady Amelia, and this young scamp is Lord Henry." She gave Henry's hand a gentle, admonishing squeeze. Eleanor rose smoothly, adopting a posture of composed authority she had practiced in the village school. "Thank you, Nurse Briggs." She turned her attention to the children. Amelia, the 10-year-old, was tall for her age and slender, with pale blonde hair neatly braided and tied with blue ribbons, large gray eyes wide with a mixture of apprehension and intense curiosity as she took in the new governess. She wore a simple blue muslin dress and held herself very still, almost unnervingly so, like a small, watchful statue. Henry, 7, was a sturdy boy with unruly dark hair much like his father's, bright blue eyes that darted around the room with restless energy, and a smudge of what looked like earth on his cheek. He wore knee breeches and a slightly rumpled white shirt, and he fidgeted, shifting his weight from foot to foot, clearly eager to be anywhere but here under scrutiny. "Good afternoon, Lady Amelia." "Good afternoon, Lord Henry," Eleanor said, her voice calm and clear, offering a small, formal smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I am Miss Thorne, your new governess." Amelia dipped a perfect, shallow curtsy. "Good afternoon, Miss Thorne," she murmured, her voice soft and precise. Henry mumbled something indistinct, his gaze fixed on the globe. "We are very pleased to welcome you to Willow Creek, Miss Thorne," Amelia added politely, the words sounding rehearsed but delivered with earnestness. "Thank you, Lady Amelia," Eleanor replied. "I look forward to commencing our lessons tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock promptly. We shall begin with arithmetic. You will find your desks prepared." She gestured towards the 2 small desks, each bearing a slate pencil, and a neatly folded cloth for cleaning. "For now, Nurse Briggs will take you to wash and prepare for tea, which will be served here shortly." Henry looked relieved. Amelia simply nodded, her large eyes still fixed on Eleanor with that unnerving quiet intensity. "Come along then, Poppets," Nurse Briggs said cheerfully, herding them gently back towards the door. "Let's get those hands washed, Master Henry, no arguments." Henry allowed himself to be steered away, casting one last, fleeting glance back at the schoolroom, while Amelia followed silently, pausing just before the door to offer another small, perfect curtsy to Eleanor before disappearing. Alone again, Eleanor exhaled slowly. They seemed manageable. The girl, quiet and biddable, if perhaps a little too still. The boy, energetic but apparently not openly rebellious. Firmness and consistency would be key, especially with Henry. She resumed her seat at the desk, reviewing her lesson plan, adding a note to begin with. Simple addition and subtraction for Henry to assess his level, while Amelia could proceed directly to long division. The scratch of the pen resumed, a comforting sound. Precisely at 4:30, a young maid arrived bearing a tray with a teapot, cups, milk, sugar, and a plate of plain buttered bread and seed cake. "Mrs. Penhaligon sends her compliments, miss," the girl said softly, placing the tray on a small table near the armchair. "Thank you," Eleanor acknowledged, not looking up from her writing until the maid had curtsied and departed. The tea was hot, strong, and exactly what she needed. She ate the bread and cake methodically, the plain flavors suiting the atmosphere of quiet industry. The light in the room deepened further, turning the dust motes into flecks of amber. Distantly, she could hear the faint sounds of the house settling for the evening, a door closing somewhere below, the distant clatter of pots from the direction of the kitchens, the ever-present, grounding tick-tock rising faintly from the hall. Finishing her tea, Eleanor stood and walked to the schoolroom window. The stable yard was empty now, the groom and horse gone. The shadows from the oaks stretched long fingers across the parkland, merging into a soft twilight haze. A single star pricked the pale lavender sky above the darkening treeline. It was a view of profound stillness, a landscape designed for contemplation, not action. Returning to her desk, she continued her planning until the light grew too dim, then lit the lamp on her desk, its warm, steady glow pushing back the gathering dusk in a small, defined circle, a pool of quiet order in the encroaching night. The bell for dressing for dinner sounded faintly through the house, a single, mellow chime. Eleanor closed her ledger, capped her inkwell, and carefully cleaned her pen. She changed into her best gray wool dress, the one reserved for evenings and Sundays, pinned her hair into its usual severe knot, and checked her reflection in the small mirror over the washstand, neat, composed, unremarkable. Precisely at 7:30, she made her way down the grand staircase, her hand lightly skimming the cool, polished wood of the balustrade, the black and white marble floor of the entrance hall echoing faintly under her careful steps. Mrs. Penhaligon materialized silently from a shadowed doorway. "This way, Miss Thorne." She led Eleanor not to the cavernous formal dining room glimpsed earlier, but to a smaller, paneled room warmed by a modest fire. A table set for 3 gleamed with polished silver and crystal under the soft light of a branched candelabra. The Duke was already there, standing by the fireplace, now impeccably dressed in evening attire, a dark tailcoat, crisp white linen, his unruly hair tamed into some semblance of order. He turned as they entered. "Miss Thorne," he acknowledged her with a slight inclination of his head. "Your Grace," Eleanor murmured, curtsying. Mrs. Penhaligon took her seat at one end of the table, the Duke at the other, indicating the chair opposite him for Eleanor. The meal commenced with a thin, clear soup served by a footman whose movements were as silent and efficient as Mrs. Penhaligon's. Conversation, when it occurred, was minimal and entirely practical. The Duke inquired briefly if her rooms were satisfactory. Eleanor confirmed they were. Mrs. Penhaligon remarked on the promising state of the late roses in the formal garden. The Duke gave a non-committal hum. Eleanor offered a quiet observation about the clarity of the evening stars she had seen from her window. The Duke glanced towards the curtained window as if mildly surprised such a thing existed, then returned his attention to his plate. Courses followed with quiet precision: poached salmon with a delicate cucumber sauce, roasted pheasant accompanied by buttered carrots and mashed turnips, a light syllabub. The food was excellent, prepared with care, yet utterly devoid of any sense of indulgence. It was sustenance served with propriety. Eleanor ate carefully, observing the exacting table manners displayed by the Duke and the housekeeper, matching them precisely. She spoke only when addressed directly, her replies brief and factual. She learned nothing new about the children beyond the Duke's earlier, sparse description, nor about the mysterious departure of Miss Havisham. The conversation circled the estate management, the weather prospects, a minor issue with a tenant farmer relayed by Mrs. Penhaligon and resolved with a few clipped words from the Duke. It was like listening to a perfectly tuned but very quiet engine. The clink of cutlery on fine china, the soft sip of water or wine, the gentle crackle of the fire, these were the dominant sounds. The Duke's presence remained a contained force. His gaze, when it occasionally rested on her, was assessing but impersonal, the gaze of an employer ensuring his new employee was settling adequately into the prescribed role. He showed no flicker of warmth, no hint of the man who had rolled up his sleeves in his study, only the distant, impeccably correct nobleman. As the footman cleared the final plates and offered a decanter of port, which the Duke accepted and Mrs. Penhaligon declined, Eleanor sensed the evening's conclusion. The Duke took a small sip of his port. "I trust the children were satisfactory upon your initial meeting, Miss Thorne." "Perfectly so, Your Grace," Eleanor replied. Lady Amelia was very polite. Lord Henry seemed energetic. The Duke's expression remained impassive. "See that the energy is channeled appropriately. Discipline is paramount. Good night, Miss Thorne." It was a clear dismissal. "Good night, Your Grace." "Good night, Mrs. Penhaligon." Eleanor rose, curtsied, and left the room, guided by the footman who opened the door for her. The cooler air of the corridor felt refreshing after the contained atmosphere of the dining room. She made her way back upstairs, the house now settling into deeper silence, the only sounds her own footsteps and the distant, rhythmic heartbeat of the clock. In her sitting room, she sat for a while in the armchair, the fire now merely embers in her grate, the lamp casting its small circle of light. The day had unfolded precisely as the Duke's schedule dictated: arrival, interview, settling in, meeting the children, tea, dinner. Every moment had been predictable, orderly, devoid of surprise or emotional turbulence. Even the children, with their contrasting temperaments, fit neatly into her expectations: the quiet, watchful girl, the active, restless boy. Challenges to be managed with routine and firmness, not sources of drama. She picked up her needlework, a simple handkerchief she was edging with white thread, and worked a few stitches, the repetitive motion soothing her mind. The wood pigeon called again, its plaintive cry echoing faintly across the now dark parkland. It was a sound that belonged to this place, a sound of solitude and stillness. She thought of the Duke's stern face across the dinner table, the absolute lack of anything resembling personal connection. It was precisely what she had sought. No demands beyond the professional, no intrusion into the carefully guarded quiet within her. Willow Creek Manor was a fortress of routine, its walls built of ticking clocks, unchanging schedules, and silent corridors. Her role was clear: maintain the geometry of quiet afternoons, fill the children's minds with useful, unexciting facts, and preserve the profound tranquility that seeped from the ancient stones. Finishing her stitch, she tied off the thread, folded the handkerchief, and placed it in her workbasket. She prepared for bed, washing her face in the cool water from the jug, brushing out her long dark hair, braiding it neatly for the night. She extinguished the lamp and slipped between the crisp linen sheets. Outside, the moon had risen, casting a pale silver light across the orderly rows of the kitchen garden visible from her window. The silence was absolute, profound, wrapping around her like a soft, heavy blanket. Distantly, the clock chimed the hour, 10 deep, resonant strokes that echoed through the sleeping house before fading back into the encompassing quiet. Eleanor closed her eyes, listening to the sound of her own steady breathing. The day had been long, filled with newness, yet its rigid structure had prevented any true disturbance. Tomorrow would be identical in its framework: lessons at 9, luncheon at 1, and so on. The predictability was a balm. She felt the gentle pull of sleep, deep and dreamless, descending as smoothly and inevitably as the river Derwent flowed towards the sea, a current of pure, unadulterated monotony carrying her into the heart of the manor's silent embrace, where excitement was not just absent, but utterly inconceivable, lost in the vast, drowsy landscape of unchanging days, Chapter 3, The Measured Cadence of Days. Dawn at Willow Creek Manor did not arrive with fanfare, but as a subtle lightening of the deep indigo sky visible through the window above Eleanor's washstand, a gradual softening of the shadows in her small, neat bedroom until the geometric patterns of the counterpane became distinct, followed by the first tentative chirps of sparrows in the ivy clinging to the garden wall below. Eleanor awoke precisely as she had done for years, moments before the distant, muffled chime of the house clock striking 6 resonated through the silent corridors, her internal rhythm already attuned to the manor's somnolent pulse. She rose immediately, splashing her face with the cool water from the blue and white jug, dressing swiftly in another serviceable gray dress, pinning her hair with mechanical efficiency into its familiar, unadorned knot before the small mirror, her reflection a study in composed practicality. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of dew-damp earth and the distant, comforting aroma of baking bread rising from the kitchens far below. By 6:30, she was seated at the writing desk in her sitting room, reviewing her meticulously drafted lesson plan for the day, the scratch of her pen adding a tiny counterpoint to the awakening sounds of the house, the faint clatter of pails from the stable yard, the distant murmur of servants' voices, the rhythmic thump of a carpet beater somewhere in the grounds. At 7, the maid arrived with a tray bearing a pot of strong tea, toast, and a small dish of marmalade. Eleanor consumed it methodically, her mind already rehearsing the introduction to French verbs. Precisely at 7:45, she gathered her books and slates and entered the schoolroom, arranging everything with exacting care on the large teacher's desk, the arithmetic primers open to the correct pages, the French grammar book marked, the slates cleaned and ready, the chalk precisely aligned. She stood at the window, watching as the groom led the bay hunter out into the yard for its morning exercise, the scene unfolding with the same quiet predictability as the day before. At 5 minutes to 9, the door opened, and Nurse Briggs ushered in Amelia and Henry. Amelia was immaculate in a fresh muslin frock, her hair rebraided, her expression one of solemn expectation, while Henry's hair still resisted complete order, his shirt collar slightly askew, and his eyes held a look of wary resignation as he shuffled towards his assigned desk. "Good morning, Miss Thorne," Amelia said clearly, executing another small, perfect curtsy. Henry mumbled a greeting, his gaze fixed on the floor. "Good morning, Lady Amelia, Lord Henry," Eleanor responded, her voice calm and authoritative. "Please take your seats. We commence with arithmetic. Lady Amelia, you will find exercises in long division on page 32 of your primer. Lord Henry, you will begin with these addition and subtraction problems." She placed a slate before Henry inscribed with neat columns of figures. "You have 15 minutes. Proceed." The next hour unfolded with the quiet intensity of focused study. The only sounds were the scratch of Henry's slate pencil, the soft turning of pages, the occasional sigh from Amelia as she concentrated on a particularly complex division, and Eleanor's own measured footsteps as she moved between the desks, observing, occasionally offering a quiet correction or word of encouragement delivered in a tone devoid of either excessive praise or disapproval. Henry proved surprisingly capable with numbers, his initial restlessness subsiding as he tackled the problems with quick, if sometimes messy, calculations. Amelia worked with meticulous care, her answers precise, her brow furrowed slightly in concentration. The predictability of numbers, their absolute truths, felt grounding to Eleanor. When the clock in the hall chimed 10, Eleanor called a halt. "Slates down. We proceed to French. Open your grammars to page 15. We will conjugate the verb *être to be." She wrote the French words neatly on the blackboard. "Je suis, tu es, il est." The children repeated the phrases after her, Amelia's pronunciation careful and clear, Henry's more hesitant but earnest. Eleanor drilled them relentlessly, the repetition of the sounds filling the room, a rhythmic chant devoid of emotional inflection, focusing solely on correct enunciation and memorization. The morning continued in this vein, geography tracing the winding course of the Thames on a large, slightly faded map pinned to the wall, English grammar parsing simple sentences about the quiet countryside surrounding Willow Creek. Eleanor's voice remained a steady, low monotone, her instructions clear, her expectations unambiguous. Luncheon, taken in the schoolroom with the children at 1 o'clock precisely, consisted of cold chicken, bread and butter, stewed apples, and milk. Conversation was minimal and confined to the subject studied. Eleanor asked factual questions about the rivers of England or the conjugation of avoir, and the children answered, Amelia with quiet confidence, Henry with less certainty but increasing effort. The afternoon brought drawing, simple geometric shapes for Henry, a careful study of a vase of late roses for Amelia, conducted in near silence broken only by the scratch of pencils and Eleanor's occasional quiet direction, softer shading here, Lady Amelia, ensure your lines are straight, Lord Henry. At 3 o'clock, the weather being fine, Nurse Briggs arrived to take the children for their prescribed hour of outdoor exercise in the south garden. Eleanor watched from the schoolroom window as Henry immediately ran towards a patch of lawn, kicking an imaginary ball, while Amelia settled on a stone bench beneath a pear tree, a book appearing instantly in her hands, her stillness remarkable even at a distance. Eleanor used the hour to review the day's work, noting Henry's aptitude for arithmetic but struggle with French pronunciation, Amelia's competence across the board but occasional tendency towards distraction, gazing not out the window but seemingly into some internal landscape during geography. She adjusted the next day's plan accordingly, adding extra French repetition for Henry and a slightly more challenging history passage for Amelia to maintain focus. Tea was taken alone in her sitting room, the quiet a welcome respite. The pattern of the evening mirrored the previous one, dressing carefully, descending to the small dining room precisely at 7:30, the same silent footman serving, the same efficient procession of courses, a delicate vegetable soup, roasted chicken with boiled potatoes and green beans, a baked custard. Conversation remained sparse and functional. The Duke inquired about the first day's progress. Satisfactory, Your Grace, Eleanor reported. Lady Amelia is diligent. Lord Henry shows aptitude in arithmetic but requires further practice in French conjugation. The Duke gave a curt nod. See that he applies himself. Discipline, Miss Thorne. Mrs. Penhaligon mentioned a delivery of new slates expected tomorrow. Eleanor acknowledged this. The Duke commented briefly on the need for rain for the late-sown barley. Eleanor murmured agreement. The clink of silverware, the soft sip of wine, the gentle crackle of the fire, the soundtrack of the evening. The Duke's presence remained aloof, contained force across the table, his dark eyes occasionally flicking to her with that same impersonal assessment, finding nothing apparently wanting in her quiet competence. The port decanter appeared. Eleanor was dismissed with the same quiet command, "Good night, Miss Thorne." The climb back to her rooms felt like entering a sanctuary. The schoolroom, tidied after the children's departure, lay in orderly gloom. Her sitting room awaited, the armchair by the cooling embers of her small fire a haven. She lit the desk lamp, its pool of light warm and contained, and took up her needlework, the handkerchief edge nearly finished now. The profound silence of the upper floor was absolute, broken only by the faint, rhythmic sigh of her own breathing and the distant, comforting heartbeat of the great clock far below. She thought not of the children, nor the Duke, nor the manor's history, but of the clean structure of the day just past, the defined blocks of time, the predictable challenges met and managed, the lack of disruption. It was deeply satisfying. Henry's minor fidgeting during French had been quelled with a single, firm look. Amelia's brief lapse into her private world during geography had been recalled with a quiet, pointed question. Order had prevailed. The wood pigeon's evening call drifted through the slightly open window, a familiar, melancholic note that now felt part of the manor's essential fabric, a sound of solitude that resonated within her. She tied off the final stitch on the handkerchief edge, examined the neat, even work with a flicker of quiet pride in its utter lack of ostentation, folded it, and placed it in her basket. Preparing for bed was the same ritual of cool water, the brush pulled through her dark hair, the tight braid secured. She extinguished the lamp and lay in the darkness. Moonlight, weaker than the night before, silvered the edges of the window frame and cast faint geometric shapes on the floor. The silence was a tangible thing, a deep, velvety absence of sound that pressed gently on her ears. Distantly, the clock chimed 10, the notes deep and resonant, echoing through the sleeping house before being absorbed once more into the stillness. Eleanor closed her eyes. The rhythm of Willow Creek was becoming her own rhythm. The measured cadence of the days, the tick of the clock, the scratch of the slate pencil, the chime of the dinner bell, the steady progression from lesson to lesson, meal to meal, was a lullaby woven from monotony. There was comfort in knowing tomorrow would unfold almost identically. French verbs at 9:30, history after luncheon, drawing in the afternoon. The potential for surprise felt remote, almost impossible within these thick stone walls and rigid schedules. Henry might fidget again, Amelia might drift, but she knew how to gently, firmly, guide them back. The Duke would sit in silent scrutiny at dinner. Mrs. Penhaligon would remark on the household. Nothing would change. The River Derwent continued its slow, unchanging journey towards the sea. The dust motes danced in the same sunbeams, the wood pigeon called its same, plaintive song. Eleanor breathed in the cool, lavender-scented air and felt the profound, drowsy weight of the manor's timeless quiet settle over her, a blanket of pure, unadulterated routine, carrying her down into a sleep as deep and uneventful as the landscape surrounding Willow Creek, where the only excitement was the turning of a page or the solving of a sum, and even that was carefully measured, contained, and swiftly resolved, leaving the vast, tranquil sea of boredom undisturbed. Chapter 4. The Dust of Small Rebellions. The days settled into a pattern as regular and unvarying as the ticking of the longcase clock in the hall below, each sunrise bleeding into the next with only the subtlest shifts in the quality of light or the faint scent carried on the breeze from the kitchen gardens, rosemary one morning, the damp earth smell after a brief, gentle night shower the next. Eleanor's life became a tapestry woven with threads of quiet instruction, solitary meals, and evenings spent in the lamplit circle of her sitting room, the needle in her hand moving with the same steady rhythm as the hands of the clock. Lessons commenced each morning at 9 with arithmetic, the clean logic of numbers providing a solid foundation. Henry, she discovered, possessed a quick, intuitive grasp for calculation, his slate pencil flying across the surface, though his script remained messy, sprawling outside the neat lines she insisted upon. Amelia approached numbers with methodical precision, her answers flawless but achieved with visible effort, her brow often furrowed in concentration that seemed almost painful in its intensity. French verbs followed, the conjugations drilled with relentless repetition that filled the schoolroom with the low murmur of je suis, tu es, il est, Amelia mimicking Eleanor's careful pronunciation with eerie accuracy, Henry stumbling over the unfamiliar sounds, his frustration manifesting in restless shuffling of his feet beneath the desk or the tapping of his slate pencil, small rebellions instantly quelled by Eleanor's firm, quiet command. Stillness, Lord Henry. Focus. Geography involved tracing the contours of continents on the large, slightly peeling map, rivers snaking blue across faded yellows and greens. History was a procession of kings and dates delivered in Eleanor's uninflected monotone, the Battle of Hastings or the signing of the Magna Carta rendered as bloodlessly as the instructions for hemming a handkerchief. Drawing occupied the quiet afternoons, Henry laboring over cubes and spheres with grim determination, Amelia capturing the precise curve of a wilting rose or the intricate pattern of a leaf with a detached, almost clinical eye. Their outdoor hour, observed by Eleanor from the schoolroom window, remained a study in contrasts, Henry a whirlwind of suppressed energy, running circuits of the lawn, kicking stones, climbing the lower branches of the ancient beech tree only to be gently but firmly called down by Nurse Briggs, Amelia a small, still figure invariably found on the same stone bench, absorbed in a book, her face pale and serious in the dappled shade, seemingly oblivious to the bees humming in the lavender nearby or the distant call of the wood pigeon that had become Eleanor's constant, melancholic companion. Dinner in the small dining room remained an exercise in polite silence punctuated by the clink of cutlery and the Duke's sparse, functional inquiries about progress. Lord Henry shows improvement in arithmetic, Your Grace, though focus remains an occasional challenge, Eleanor would report. Lady Amelia's application is commendable. The Duke's response was invariably a curt nod and the single word, discipline, spoken like a commandment carved in stone. He remained a figure of remote authority, impeccably dressed, his gaze impersonal, the fleeting glimpse of the man who rolled up his sleeves in his study seeming like a figment of her imagination. Mrs. Penhaligon offered observations on household matters, the need to air the drawing-room carpets, the excellent yield from the orchard, her voice as precise and unemotional as her posture. Eleanor's replies were brief, factual mirrors reflecting the conversation offered. She learned nothing more of Miss Haversham, the children's mother, a subject never broached, or the world beyond the estate's boundaries. The manor was her universe, bounded by routine and silence. One Tuesday, however, a mote of disruption, fine as dust yet momentarily jarring, drifted into the carefully controlled atmosphere of the schoolroom. They were engaged in parsing sentences, the swift river flows silently through the green valley, a task Amelia performed flawlessly, identifying subject, verb, object with quiet efficiency. Henry, however, was struggling. The concept seemed to elude him, his frustration mounting as Eleanor patiently explained the structure for the third time. His brow furrowed, his small hands clenched on the edge of his desk. But why is river the subject, Miss Thorne? He burst out, his voice louder than the hushed tones usually permitted, tinged with genuine confusion and a spark of the spiritedness his father had mentioned. It's just water moving. Why must it do anything? Amelia looked up from her perfect diagram, her gray eyes wide with surprise at this breach of decorum. Eleanor felt a flicker of something unexpected, not anger, but a faint, unwelcome stirring of interest. The question, while born of frustration, held a kernel of raw, unschooled curiosity. She quashed it instantly. "The rules of grammar provide order and clarity, Lord Henry," she stated, her voice cool and level, devoid of any inflection that might encourage further debate. "The river is the subject because it performs the action of flowing. That is the structure of the English language. Please attempt the next sentence." She pointed to the slate. Henry glared at the offending sentence. "The old oak tree stands tall on the hill," his jaw set. For a moment, rebellion flashed in his bright blue eyes. He picked up his slate pencil with unnecessary force. Then, whether it was the weight of Eleanor's unwavering gaze, the ingrained expectation of obedience, or simply the baffling nature of grammar itself, the spark died. His shoulders slumped slightly, the defiance replaced by a familiar, sullen resignation. "Yes, Miss Thorne," he muttered, hunching over his slate, his pencil scraping with aggrieved energy. The incident lasted less than a minute. Order was restored. Amelia returned to her flawless parsing. Eleanor resumed her slow patrol between the desks. Yet, the air in the room felt subtly altered for a few moments, charged with the brief, crackling energy of Henry's small rebellion before settling back into its usual, dust-moted stillness. The rest of the day proceeded with clockwork precision. Luncheon eaten in near silence, a history lesson on the orderly reign of Edward I, an hour of drawing where Henry attacked his geometric shapes with unusual vigor, pressing so hard his pencil snapped, requiring a brief, practical interlude while Eleanor sharpened a new one with a small, efficient knife. The afternoon airing passed without incident, Henry running with pent-up energy, Amelia reading. Dinner that evening was indistinguishable from any other. The Duke inquired about the day's lessons. "Satisfactory, Your Grace," Eleanor reported, omitting the minor upheaval over the grammatical river. Lord Henry applied himself diligently to arithmetic and drawing. The Duke nodded, his attention already returning to the perfectly roasted lamb on his plate. "Good. Consistency is key." Later, in her sitting room, Eleanor took up her needlework, a new project, a serviceable gray stocking, but her fingers paused over the smooth wool. The image of Henry's frustrated face, the spark of genuine confusion in his eyes before it was dampened, lingered unexpectedly. It was a small thing, insignificant within the vast, unchanging landscape of Willow Creek. A single ripple on the surface of the deep, still Derwent. Yet, it had stirred something within her, a faint echo of a time when questions felt vital, not disruptive. She frowned, focusing intently on the next stitch, pulling the thread taut with precise force. Such thoughts were irrelevant. Order, discipline, routine, these were the pillars upon which tranquility rested. Henry's question had been a demand for understanding, a natural impulse, but one that threatened the smooth, uneventful surface she was tasked with maintaining. It was her duty to guide him towards acceptance, not to engage with the turbulence beneath. She recalled the swiftness with which his rebellion had subsided, the familiar weight of resignation settling back onto his small shoulders. It was a victory for the Manor's pervasive quiet, for the measured cadence of their days. The stocking took shape under her fingers, row after identical row of neat, gray stitches. The fire crackled softly, a low, rhythmic sound. The wood pigeon called its plaintive, unanswered cry into the deepening twilight. Eleanor breathed in the scent of beeswax and lavender, allowing the profound silence of the house to wash over her, to smooth away the faint, unwelcome wrinkle caused by Henry's grammatical confusion. The dust of his small rebellion settled back onto the well-polished surface of routine. Tomorrow would be the same. French verbs at 9:30, history after luncheon, drawing in the afternoon. Henry might fidget, Amelia might drift, but the structure would hold. The Duke would sit in silent judgment at dinner. The clock would tick, the river would flow. The profound, enveloping boredom, thick and soft as the velvet curtains in the drawing room, remained undisturbed, a comforting shroud over the quiet heart of Willow Creek Manor, where even the dust motes danced in predictable paths through the shafts of afternoon sun. The small ripple vanished, leaving only the deep, still water of routine stretching endlessly ahead. Chapter 5, The Grammar of Rain and the Geometry of Patience. The morning dawned not with the familiar, gradual suffusion of pale gold, but under a low, uniform ceiling of dove-gray cloud that pressed heavily upon the Derbyshire landscape, leaching the color from the emerald meadows and turning the distant river Derwent into a dull, leaden ribbon. The air in Eleanor's bedroom felt thick, damp, and peculiarly still, carrying only the intensified scent of wet earth and the bruised petals of the late roses clinging to the garden walls below. She dressed with the same mechanical precision, the gray wool of her dress feeling slightly heavier against her skin, a tangible echo of the atmospheric pressure. The routine downstairs remained unchanged, the quiet review of lessons over strong tea and toast, the methodical preparation of the schoolroom, yet the altered light filtering through the tall windows cast elongated, indistinct shadows, making the familiar space feel subtly alien, less defined, as if the world outside was blurring at the edges. Precisely at 5 minutes to 9, Nurse Briggs delivered the children. Amelia, paler than usual in her blue muslin, seemed almost to merge with the gloom, her gray eyes wide and watchful, while Henry entered with a barely contained energy, his bright blue eyes scanning the dim room like a caged bird, his fingers drumming a silent, restless tattoo against his thigh before he forcibly stilled them upon seeing Eleanor's composed figure waiting by the teacher's desk. "Good morning, Miss Thorne," Amelia murmured, her curtsy a pale ghost of its usual crispness. Henry's greeting was a mumbled rush, his gaze darting towards the window where the first heavy drops of rain began to strike the glass with fat, deliberate splashes. "Good morning. Please take your seats. We commence with Latin declensions." Eleanor's voice, if anything, was even more measured, a deliberate anchor in the shifting atmosphere. She had anticipated the potential for restlessness brought by confinement and had chosen Latin, its rigid, unyielding structure a bulwark against the formless weather. The first hour crawled. The drone of mensa, mensae, mensae, mensum, mensa, filled the room, punctuated by the increasingly insistent drumming of the rain on the windowpanes and the gurgle of water coursing down drainpipes outside. Amelia repeated the forms with her usual detached precision, but her gaze kept flickering towards the weeping glass. Henry, however, was a coiled spring. His initial attempts at recitation were jerky, distracted, he fidgeted constantly, shifting in his seat, tapping his foot, twisting a button on his jacket until Eleanor fixed him with a quelling look. He subsided, but the energy merely pooled, simmering beneath the surface. His slate pencil snapped during an exercise on the accusative case, the sharp crack startling in the muffled room. A flush rose on his neck as he stared at the broken pieces. "Composure, Lord Henry," Eleanor stated calmly, handing him a fresh pencil from her desk drawer. "Proceed from Puella." His hand trembled slightly as he took it, the frustration palpable in the tense line of his small shoulders. By mid-morning, the rain had settled into a steady, monotonous downpour, turning the view from the schoolroom window into a watercolor wash of grays and greens. Geography, usually a passive tracing of lines, became an exercise in supreme focus. Eleanor pinned a fresh map of Europe to the board, its crisp paper stark against the gloom. "Trace the course of the Danube, Lord Henry, from its source to the Black Sea. Label the principal cities it passes through." She handed him a pointer. Henry approached the map, the pointer clutched like a weapon. He began well enough, finding the source in the Black Forest, his finger tracing the blue line eastwards. But as he reached Vienna, his movements grew quicker, less precise. Budapest blurred past. The pointer skittered across the Balkans, missing Belgrade entirely, jabbing towards Bucharest. "Accuracy, Lord Henry," Eleanor interjected, her voice cutting through the drumming rain. "Recall the position of Belgrade. South of the river, before it turns north." Henry stopped, his breath coming in short, audible bursts. He stared at the map, the multitude of lines and names seeming to swim before his eyes. The frustration that had been building all morning crested. "It's all just squiggles," he burst out, his voice cracking, the pointer dropping from his hand to clatter loudly on the floorboards. He spun around, his small face flushed, eyes bright with unshed tears of impotent rage. "Why must I trace this stupid river in the stupid rain? I want to run. I want to climb the beech tree." The outburst hung in the air, raw and shocking against the backdrop of Latin declensions and rain. Amelia gasped softly, her book slipping from her lap, her face a mask of wide-eyed apprehension. The silence that followed was profound, filled only by the relentless downpour and Henry's ragged breathing. Eleanor felt the familiar, cool mantle of control settle over her, but beneath it, a complex flicker, a pang at the raw misery in the boy's voice, swiftly overlaid by the absolute necessity of restoring order. This was the challenge inherent in the Duke's command of discipline. She did not raise her voice. She did not move. She simply looked at Henry, her gaze steady, implacable, holding his turbulent blue eyes with her own calm brown ones. The seconds stretched, measured by the drumming rain. Henry's defiance wavered under that silent, unwavering scrutiny. The flush on his neck deepened, his lower lip trembled. He looked down at the fallen pointer, then up at Eleanor, the fight draining out of him as swiftly as it had ignited, replaced by a dawning fear of consequence. "Pick up the pointer, Lord Henry," Eleanor said, her voice low but carrying absolute authority in the quiet room. Henry flinched, then bent down, his movements stiff with shame, and retrieved the pointer. "Return to your desk." He did so, shoulders slumped, head bowed, the picture of abject defeat. "Lady Amelia," Eleanor continued, her tone shifting only slightly, "please retrieve your book." Amelia scrambled to obey, her hands trembling slightly. Eleanor walked slowly to the map. She picked up a piece of chalk. "The Danube," she began, her voice resuming its usual, uninflected drone, as if the outburst had been nothing more than a brief, inconsequential shower, "rises in the Black Forest, Germany." She drew a precise dot. "It flows east, passing through Regensburg." Her chalk moved with deliberate slowness, marking each city with a neat cross, her explanation dry, factual, utterly devoid of drama. She pointed to Belgrade. "Here, south of the river bend. Note its position." She handed the chalk to Henry, who was still staring fixedly at his desk. "Lord Henry, mark Belgrade." He rose slowly, took the chalk with a hand that still trembled faintly, and approached the map. He hesitated, then made a small, careful cross precisely where Eleanor had indicated. "Correct. Proceed to Budapest." The lesson continued, painfully slow, methodical, a grinding exercise in regained control. Henry traced the river with excruciating care, his movements stiff, his voice a monotone when required to name a city. The rain continued its ceaseless drumming. Luncheon, taken in the schoolroom, was a silent affair. Henry pushed his cold mutton and boiled potatoes around his plate, eating little. Amelia nibbled at her bread and butter, her gaze flitting nervously between Eleanor and her brother. The afternoon brought needlework, an activity Eleanor deemed suitably calming and silent. Henry was set to darning a practice sock, a task requiring repetitive stitches. He attacked it with grim determination, his small brow furrowed in fierce concentration, as if subduing the needle and thread was a way to subdue the turmoil inside him. The rhythmic in and out of the needle, the pull of the thread, became a meditation in enforced patience. Amelia embroidered a simple flower with her customary detached precision, the tiny stitches appearing like magic beneath her fingers. The only sounds were the hiss of the rain, the occasional snip of scissors, and the faint sigh of thread being drawn through linen. Eleanor watched Henry's intense focus, the way his knuckles whitened on the needle, the rigid set of his jaw. It was discipline, yes, but it was a brittle thing, born of shame and suppression, not understanding. A small, cold knot formed in Eleanor's stomach, quickly dismissed. Order had been restored. The rebellion, louder than the previous grammatical ripple, had been contained. That was paramount. The alternative, chaos, unpredictability, was unthinkable. When Nurse Briggs arrived to collect them at 4, Henry placed his half-darned sock on the table with unnatural care, avoiding Eleanor's eyes. Amelia rose silently, offering her usual, subdued curtsy. The schoolroom door closed behind them, leaving Eleanor alone with the drumming rain and the lingering tension, slowly dissipating like mist. She tidied the needlework materials, her movements precise. The rain intensified, lashing against the windows. Tea arrived, a welcome ritual of warmth and quiet. She sat by the small fire she'd lit in her sitting room grate, the flames struggling against the pervasive damp, casting flickering, distorted shadows on the walls. The incident replayed in her mind. Henry's explosive frustration, the raw need for movement stifled by walls and weather, the swift, crushing weight of her imposed silence. She sipped her tea, its heat spreading through her. Discipline. The Duke's edict. It was the geometry that held their fragile world together, the straight lines and right angles that defined their existence against the formless chaos outside, the rain, the mud, the unruly energy of a small boy. Henry's outburst was a flaw in the pattern, a jagged tear in the smooth fabric of their days. Her response, cool, implacable silence, had been the needle pulling the thread taut again, mending the rent, however imperfectly. It was necessary. It was her duty. The alternative was ungovernable. She thought of the Duke's stern face, the expectation of absolute control. She had delivered it. Dinner that evening was a study in heightened restraint. The rain lashed against the dining room windows, a constant, murmuring counterpoint to the silence within. The Duke inquired about the day's lessons. Eleanor met his gaze squarely. Latin declensions and European geography were the principal subjects, Your Grace. Progress was made, despite the inclement weather necessitating indoor recreation. She paused, choosing her words with the precision of a grammarian. Lord Henry experienced a momentary lapse in composure during geography, which was promptly addressed and corrected. He subsequently applied himself diligently to needlework. The Duke's eyes, dark and unreadable in the candlelight, rested on her for a beat longer than usual. He gave a single, slow nod. Lapses must be rectified immediately. Discipline is not merely expected, it is essential. Well handled, Miss Thorne. The words were an absolution, delivered in his usual clipped tone, yet they landed with unexpected weight. Thank you, Your Grace, Eleanor murmured, lowering her gaze to her plate of poached turbot in white sauce. Mrs. Penhaligon remarked on the need to check the attics for leaks. The conversation moved on. Eleanor ate, the food tasteless, the praise settling like a stone in her stomach. Well handled, the swift suppression of a small boy's spirit in the face of suffocating boredom. Was that her achievement? Later, in her sitting room, the rain a relentless symphony on the roof and windows, Eleanor took up her gray stocking. The rhythmic click of her needles should have been soothing, but tonight it felt like the ticking of a monstrous clock. The image of Henry's face, first defiant, then crushed, intruded. The brittle intensity of his focus on the darning needle. It was a different kind of stillness than Amelia's, not peaceful absorption, but a clenched fist of suppressed feeling. The geometry of patience, enforced by her unyielding will. The fire had burned low, leaving the room filled with shifting shadows and the damp chill creeping in from the sodden world outside. The wood pigeon was silent, driven to shelter. Only the rain spoke, a thousand insistent whispers against the glass. Eleanor forced her fingers to move, stitch after stitch, row after row. She focused on the texture of the wool, the precise angle of each loop. Order, control, discipline. The words echoed the Duke's command, the foundation stones of her existence at Willow Creek. Henry's rebellion had been a crack in the edifice, swiftly mortared over. The manor's profound quiet, deepened by the rain, was a testament to its endurance. Tomorrow, the rain might stop. Lessons would resume. French verbs, history, drawing. Henry might be subdued, watchful. Or the spark might flicker again. It didn't matter. She knew the pattern. She knew her response. The needle moved, the stocking grew, the rain fell. The deep, abiding boredom, now tinged with the damp chill of enforced resignation, settled back over Willow Creek Manor, thicker and heavier than before, a shroud woven from gray wool, laden declensions, and the ceaseless, monotonous drumming of the rain on endless, identical slates. The dust of this rebellion, too, would settle, absorbed into the vast, silent patience of the stones. Chapter 6, The Calculus of Autumn and the Persistence of Dust. The heavy, drumming rain of the previous day subsided overnight, leaving Willow Creek swathed in a damp, clinging mist that rose wraith-like from the saturated meadows and coiled around the ancient oaks like smoke. The air in Eleanor's room felt thick, cool, and smelled powerfully of decaying leaves and wet stone when she awoke to the familiar chime of 6 o'clock. The landscape visible from her window was monochrome, the vibrant greens of summer muted to olive and sage, the distant river a pewter smear lost in the shifting gray. Autumn, with its slow, inevitable calculus of decay, was etching its presence onto the manor and its grounds, a process as gradual and predictable as the lessons conducted within the schoolroom walls. Eleanor dressed, the wool of her gray dress a welcome barrier against the pervasive damp chill that seemed to seep through the very stones. The routine downstairs offered its usual anchor. The strong tea, the review of lessons, today, French verbs, the imperfect tense, English composition, descriptive paragraphs on familiar scenes, arithmetic, fractions for Henry, more complex equations for Amelia, the silent preparation of the schoolroom under the flat, diffused light that struggled through the mist. When Nurse Briggs delivered the children, Amelia seemed even paler, almost translucent in the gloom, her gray eyes large and shadowed, while Henry entered with a visible effort at control, his movements stiff, his gaze carefully avoiding Eleanor's as he slid into his seat, his hands clasped tightly together on the desk as if physically containing his energy. "Good morning, Miss Thorne," Amelia murmured, her curtsy shallow, her voice barely audible. Henry's greeting was a low mumble directed at his slate. "Good morning, imperfect tense of Fenrir, Lady Amelia, if you please. Je finissez." The morning unfolded with a brittle, enforced calm. The French verbs rolled out, Amelia conjugating flawlessly but with a mechanical flatness, Henry stumbling over the unfamiliar endings, his voice tight with suppressed effort, his knuckles white where he gripped the edge of his desk. Eleanor moved between them, her own voice a model of uninflected instruction, her corrections delivered with cool precision. The tension from the previous day lingered like the mist outside, a palpable presence thickening the air. Henry's rebellion had been quashed, but the cost was etched in his unnatural stillness, the absence of even his usual minor fidgeting. It was a different kind of challenge for Eleanor, maintaining order not against overt disruption, but against this heavy mantle of sullen resignation. It required a different geometry of patience, one built on unwavering consistency and the absolute refusal to acknowledge the undercurrents. English composition proved a minor battleground. Describe the view from the schoolroom window this morning, Eleanor instructed. Amelia bent her head, her pencil moving swiftly, filling her page with precise, melancholic observations. The mist hangs like a shroud, the trees are skeletal fingers, the world is drained of color. Her prose was stark, evocative in its bleakness, yet delivered with the same detached precision as her parsing. Henry stared at his blank page, his pencil unmoving. The mist outside seemed to press against the glass. Minutes ticked by. Lord Henry, Eleanor prompted, her voice level. Begin with the sensory details. What do you see? What do you hear? He shifted slightly, his jaw clenched. Gray, he muttered finally, scrawling the word at the top of the page. Just gray, and wet, and quiet, horribly quiet, he added. Quiet, with a vicious stab of his pencil that nearly tore the paper. Expand, Eleanor instructed, ignoring the tone. Describe the quality of the quiet. Is it peaceful, oppressive? Henry glared at the page. It's like being buried, he said, his voice low and fierce. Alive, he wrote, buried alive, with trembling fingers, then crossed it out violently, leaving a dark smudge. He took a shuddering breath, then began again, his script jagged and angry. The mist is thick. It hides everything. You can hear water dripping. It is very quiet. It was bare, resentful, devoid of the descriptive flair Eleanor sought, but it was completed. She accepted it with a curt nod. Adequate. Ensure legibility next time. The arithmetic lesson that followed offered Henry a fragile sanctuary. Fractions, with their clear rules and tangible solutions, provided a structure he could grasp. He tackled the problems with a fierce, almost desperate concentration, his messy figures sprawling across the slate but the answers consistently correct. Amelia solved her equations with her usual methodical accuracy, but her gaze drifted more than once towards the weeping window, her mind seemingly adrift in the gray expanse beyond. Luncheon was eaten in near silence, broken only by the clink of cutlery and the distant drip of water from the eaves. Henry ate mechanically, his eyes downcast. Amelia picked at her food, her expression distant. The mist showed no sign of lifting, rendering the planned outdoor exercise impossible. Needlework, Eleanor announced, retrieving the half-darned sock in Amelia's flower embroidery. The afternoon settled into the rhythmic monotony of needle and thread. Henry attacked his darning with the same grim intensity he'd applied to fractions, each stitch a small victory over chaos, a testament to enforced control. Amelia's needle moved with silent, automatic grace, the emerging flower on her linen a spot of unnatural, precise color in the gray room. Eleanor watched them, her own gray stocking growing steadily on her lap. The silence was profound, broken only by the whisper of thread, the occasional sigh from the settling house, and the persistent, melancholic drip 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 outside. She felt the weight of the Duke's approval from the previous evening well handled like a metal pin to her sternum. It was cold, necessary, yet, observing Henry's clenched jaw, the almost painful rigidity of his small frame, a question, unwelcome and faint, stirred within her. Was this victory? Was this brittle stillness, this suffocated spark, truly preferable to the messy, vital energy of his frustration? She quashed the thought instantly, focusing on the precise twist of her wool around the needle. Order, control, discipline, the trinity that governed Willow Creek. The alternative was the formless chaos of the mist, the unpredictable torrent of the rain. This enforced quiet, however brittle, was the foundation. Later, as the early autumn dusk began to seep into the corners of the schoolroom, Nurse Briggs arrived. Henry placed his sock, now meticulously darned across the hole, on the table with exaggerated care. Amelia set her embroidery aside, the flower complete, perfect, and utterly lifeless. They departed without a word, the door closing softly on the deepening gloom. Eleanor tidied, the simple actions a meditation. The mist was finally thinning outside, revealing the skeletal outlines of the trees against a bruised purple sky. A single, watery star appeared. Dinner that evening held a subtle shift. The Duke, perhaps noting the lingering damp chill, had ordered a slightly larger fire in the small dining room grate. Its crackle provided a warmer counterpoint to the usual silence. He inquired, as ever, about the day. French verbs and English composition were the focus, Your Grace, Eleanor reported. Lady Amelia's descriptive work was detailed. Lord Henry completed his arithmetic and needlework tasks with diligence. She paused, then added, choosing her words with the precision of a mathematician balancing an equation, the inclement weather necessitated indoor recreation throughout. The Duke nodded, his gaze resting on her for a moment. The mist is persistent. Autumn establishes itself. He took a sip of wine. A letter arrived today, an invitation to the Michaelmas Fair at Bakewell. Mrs. Penhaligon looked up, a flicker of something, surprise, in her usually impassive eyes. The fair, Your Grace. It is quite the event, I recall. Livestock, handicrafts, gingerbread. Her voice trailed off, the unspoken question hanging in the air. The Duke's expression remained remote. Unnecessary. The children's studies cannot be disrupted. The crowds, the noise, unsuitable. He spoke with finality, turning his attention back to his plate of roasted venison. Indeed, Your Grace, Mrs. Penhaligon murmured, her gaze dropping. The bustle would be most unsettling. Eleanor felt a peculiar sensation, a faint, internal lurch quickly suppressed. The fair, gingerbread, crowds, noise, concepts as alien and jarring as fireworks in the schoolroom. Yet, for a fleeting instant, she imagined Henry's face alight, not with rebellion, but with simple, uncomplicated wonder. Amelia, perhaps, momentarily drawn out of her stillness. It was a ridiculous, dangerous thought. The Duke was right, unnecessary, disruptive, quite unsuitable. Eleanor echoed softly, her voice a seamless part of the room's quiet fabric. The meal concluded with the usual port decanter. Eleanor was dismissed. Climbing the stairs, the house felt enveloped in a deeper silence, the mist outside now a silver veil under the rising moon. In her sitting room, she lit the lamp but didn't immediately take up her needlework. She walked to the window. The mist had lifted entirely, revealing the parkland bathed in cold moonlight. The skeletal trees cast long, sharp shadows. The world was clear, crisp, and utterly still. The wood pigeon did not call. She thought of the Duke's swift dismissal of the fair, of Henry's clenched hands, of Amelia's drifting gaze, of the relentless drip of rain in the suffocating gray. Order prevailed. The structure held. The dust of rebellion, the outburst over the Danube, the buried alive composition, had settled, absorbed back into the fabric of routine. The profound boredom, deepened now by the encroaching melancholy of autumn and the ghost of a rejected gingerbread fair, settled over her, thick and heavy as the velvet curtains in the unused drawing room. It was a familiar weight, a comfortable shroud. She picked up her gray stocking. The needles clicked, a steady metronome in the silence. Stitch after stitch, row after row. The geometry of their lives remained intact. Straight lines, right angles, unyielding planes of duty and silence. The mist might clear, revealing the stark beauty of decay, but within the walls of Willow Creek Manor, the calculus remained unchanged. Tomorrow. French verbs at 9:30. History after luncheon. Perhaps drawing, if the light permitted. Henry would be subdued. Amelia would be distant. The Duke would sit in judgment. The clock would tick, and the dust, the persistent, inescapable dust of quiet desperation, would continue to settle, layer upon invisible layer, on every polished surface and every still, obedient heart within the vast, sleeping embrace of the house. It was the price of peace. It was the essence of Willow Creek. She pulled the gray wool taut, the next stitch forming perfectly, a tiny, unremarkable knot in the endless, seamless fabric of their days. The silence deepened, wrapping around her like the coming frost, a lullaby of exquisite, unchanging monotony. Chapter 7, The Metamorphosis of Routine and the Dust of Discovery. The slow, inexorable calculus of autumn continued its work upon Willow Creek Manor. The mornings arrived later, wrapped in damp, chill fogs that clung stubbornly to the hollows of the parkland long after the weak sun had climbed above the skeletal treeline, and the evenings drew in with increasing haste, the twilight deepening swiftly from bruised purple to velvety black, punctuated only by the stark brilliance of stars glimpsed through the now bare branches of the great oaks. The air inside the manor grew perceptibly cooler, carrying the pervasive scent of wood smoke from the newly lit fires in the grates downstairs and the faint, melancholy aroma of chrysanthemums arranged by Mrs. Penhaligon's exacting hand in the entrance hall. Eleanor's routine adapted with seamless precision, an extra shawl worn over her gray dress, the small fire in her sitting room grate lit earlier in the afternoon, the lamp on her desk burning for longer stretches as the daylight dwindled. Lessons continued their unvarying procession, French verbs marching through past historic and future perfect tenses with relentless regularity, arithmetic delving deeper into fractions and introducing decimals for Henry, more complex algebra for Amelia, history charting the orderly reigns of Plantagenet kings with the same detached focus as geography traced the contours of the Pyrenees. Henry remained contained, a vessel holding turbulent waters under immense pressure. His outbursts ceased, replaced by a watchful stillness that manifested in overly precise movements, the careful placement of his slate, the meticulous, if still messy, formation of his numbers, the rigid control of his posture. He answered questions when asked, completed his tasks with dogged determination, but the spark of restless energy had banked, leaving only embers glowing in the depths of his blue eyes, occasionally flaring when a particularly tricky sum was solved or a French pronunciation finally mastered after painful repetition. Amelia drifted further into her own quiet world. Her work remained flawless, her curtsy perfect, her responses polite, yet her large gray eyes seemed focused on some internal horizon far beyond the schoolroom walls or the pages of her primers. She spent her outdoor hour, when the weather grudgingly permitted, not reading on the bench, but simply sitting, staring at the frost-touched grass or the leaden sky, her expression unreadable, a stillness more profound than mere obedience. The profound boredom that was Willow Creek's defining atmosphere thickened, becoming a drowsy paralysis, a collective holding of breath as the year wound down towards its dormant phase. It was during a particularly gray and still afternoon devoted to natural philosophy, a subject Eleanor approached with the same dry factualism as history, reducing the marvels of the natural world to lists of properties and classifications, that an unexpected variable insinuated itself into the equation. They were studying insects, a topic Eleanor found vaguely distasteful but included for comprehensiveness. She had procured a few pinned specimens, a common cabbage white butterfly, a stag beetle, a rather bedraggled-looking bumblebee, displayed under glass domes. Amelia regarded them with detached interest, her finger tracing the label beneath the butterfly. Henry, however, leaned forward, his usual containment momentarily forgotten. "Where did they come from, Miss Thorne?" he asked, his voice low but holding a genuine curiosity she hadn't heard since his grammatical rebellion weeks ago. "The gardens, I presume, Lord Henry," Eleanor replied, keeping her tone neutral. "Before the frosts, but how does this," he pointed a hesitant finger towards the fat, grub-like larva depicted in a diagram of the butterfly's life cycle in their textbook, "turn into that?" He gestured towards the delicate, winged creature under glass. "It seems impossible." Amelia glanced up, a flicker of something akin to interest crossing her pale features. Eleanor felt the familiar instinct to deflect, to return to the safe territory of nomenclature and anatomy. Metamorphosis is a process of complete transformation, governed by inherent biological imperatives. The dry, textbook sentence hovered on her lips. But something, perhaps the sheer, unvarnished wonder in Henry's question, so different from his previous frustrated outbursts, or perhaps the sheer weight of the surrounding monotony, gave her pause. The silence stretched, the clock ticked, the dust motes hung suspended in a shaft of pallid light. "It is a remarkable process," she heard herself say, the words feeling strange, almost alien in the dry schoolroom air. "The caterpillar, it consumes, grows, then forms a chrysalis. Within that stillness, unseen, the transformation occurs. The tissues break down, rearrange, and the adult form emerges." She pointed to the diagram. "See here, the imaginal discs," she faltered, realizing the term was beyond them. "Special cells," she simplified, "hold the blueprint for the wings, the antennae. They grow and develop while the old form dissolves." Henry's eyes were wide, fixed on the diagram, then flicking to the pinned butterfly. "Dissolves. Inside its own skin. Essentially, yes, it is a complete reorganization. A death and rebirth within a single life." The words felt heavy, charged with a significance that resonated uncomfortably in the quiet room. Amelia was watching her now, truly watching, not drifting. "Why?" Henry breathed, the single word holding a weight of pure, unadulterated curiosity. "Why does it do that?" Eleanor met his gaze. The cool mantle of the governess felt thin. "To fulfill its purpose, Lord Henry. To fly, to find a mate, to lay eggs for the next generation. The crawling form cannot do that. It must change." The explanation hung in the air. The pinned specimens under their glass domes seemed suddenly poignant, artifacts of a process violently arrested. The gray afternoon pressed in, yet the schoolroom felt subtly altered, charged with the dust of this unexpected discovery, this glimpse into a hidden, transformative violence beneath the surface of the familiar. "Can we?" Henry hesitated, glancing nervously at Eleanor, as if expecting a rebuke for overstepping. Can we find a chrysalis? To see, before winter. The request was impossible, disruptive, unplanned. Eleanor opened her mouth to deliver the expected refusal, to steer them back to the classification of Coleoptera. But the image of the chrysalis, that vessel of silent, radical transformation, held her. And the look in Henry's eyes, not defiance, but a yearning for understanding, for connection to the mystery just glimpsed. The season is advanced, she stated, her voice regaining its customary firmness, but lacking its usual finality. Most chrysalides would be hidden, dormant for winter. However, she added, seeing the hope dim in his face, we might observe the signs. The feeding plants, the shed larval skins, perhaps, if we look carefully in the sheltered corners of the kitchen garden walls during your outdoor hour tomorrow, weather permitting. Nurse Briggs would accompany you. It was a concession, minor, contained within the existing structure, yet it felt momentous. Henry's face lit with a cautious, incredulous joy. Truly, Miss Thorne, as an adjunct to your natural philosophy studies, Lord Henry. Observation is a key scientific principle. She turned to Amelia. You may make sketches of any relevant findings, Lady Amelia. Amelia nodded slowly, a thoughtful expression replacing her habitual detachment. Yes, Miss Thorne. The rest of the lesson passed in a haze for Eleanor. She finished explaining the basic taxonomy, her voice sounding distant to her own ears. Henry listened with unprecedented attentiveness, his questions now focused, relevant to the topic of insect life cycles. Amelia made notes with unusual care. When Nurse Briggs arrived, Henry practically vibrated with suppressed excitement, whispering urgently to his sister about, looking near the old wall where the nettles grow thick. The door closed behind them, leaving Eleanor alone with the pinned insects and the echo of her own unprecedented deviation. She tidied the specimens away, her hands moving automatically. The chrysalis, dissolution, reorganization, purpose. The words circled in her mind, unsettling the sediment of her carefully maintained routine. She had introduced an element of the unknown, the unpredictable, into the sterile geometry of their days. A search, an observation, a potential discovery. It was terrifyingly small, yet it felt like a crack in the ice. Later, in the small dining room, the fire crackling with more vigor against the deepening autumn chill, the Duke inquired about the day's lessons. Natural philosophy, Your Grace, Eleanor reported, her voice steady. The life cycles of insects. The children displayed heightened interest. She paused, then added, the words feeling like stones dropped into still water. Lord Henry inquired about metamorphosis. I suggested a practical observation exercise in the kitchen garden tomorrow, weather permitting, to locate evidence of chrysalides, supervised by Nurse Briggs. Lady Amelia will sketch findings. She braced for the inevitable correction, the reminder that such diversions were unnecessary, potentially disruptive. The Duke chewed a mouthful of roasted partridge thoughtfully. He glanced at Mrs. Penhaligon, who offered a minute, almost imperceptible shrug. Practical observation, the Duke repeated, his deep voice neutral. Within bounds, and under supervision, it has merit. Ensure it remains focused and does not encroach upon scheduled study time. Of course, Your Grace, Eleanor murmured, a strange mixture of relief and trepidation. Settling in her chest, discipline remains paramount, he added, his dark eyes meeting hers, holding the familiar, unyielding command. Naturally, Your Grace. The meal continued. Mrs. Penhaligon remarked on the effectiveness of the new smokejack in the kitchen chimney. Eleanor ate her custard, tasting nothing. Back in her sitting room, the fire casting long, dancing shadows, Eleanor took up her needlework, a new project, a gray muffler this time. But the rhythmic click of the needles failed to soothe. Her mind returned to the chrysalis. That state of suspended animation, the hidden turmoil within the stillness. Was Willow Creek a chrysalis? Holding them all in a state of enforced dormancy. Henry, his energy suppressed, Amelia, her spirit drifting, herself, her own inner landscape carefully walled off, reduced to lesson plans and needlework. What was their purpose here, within these walls? To emerge as, what? Perfectly disciplined automatons, the Duke's ideal subjects of quiet application. The thought was chilling. She looked down at the gray wool winding around her needles. Stitch after stitch, row after row. Building a barrier against the cold, yes, but also against life. The vibrant, messy, transformative life Henry's question had momentarily invoked. She shook her head, a sharp, involuntary movement. These were dangerous, disruptive thoughts. Order, control, discipline. The chrysalis observation was a minor concession, a controlled experiment within the larger, unchanging experiment of Willow Creek. It would satisfy Henry's curiosity briefly, then routine would reassert itself. The profound boredom, momentarily stirred by the dust of discovery, would settle back, thicker and deeper than before, a sediment of quiet resignation over the hidden potential for change. She pulled the gray wool taut, the next stitch forming with decisive precision. Purpose, fulfillment, flight, concepts as alien as the Michaelmas fair. Her purpose was here, to maintain the geometry, to enforce the silence, to ensure the dust settled. The manor, vast and ancient, seemed to sigh around her, its stones holding centuries of similar quietude. The wood pigeon, silent for so long, called once, a single, mournful note that hung in the frosty air before being swallowed by the encompassing stillness. Eleanor bent her head, the lamplight gleaming on the dark, disciplined knot of her hair, and resumed her stitching, the needles clicking a steady, hypnotic rhythm against the vast, sleeping silence, a metronome measuring the slow, uneventful passage towards winter within the chrysalis of Willow Creek Manor. The discovery, she told herself firmly, would be safely contained. The metamorphosis of routine was complete stagnation, and that was the only acceptable outcome. Chapter 8, The Frost-Bitten Hunt in the Dust of Unseen Eyes. The dawn arrived brittle and sharp, the kind of cold that seemed to crackle in the air and bite at exposed skin. A hard frost had silvered the world overnight, etching intricate, feathery patterns on the schoolroom windowpanes and transforming the parkland into a monochrome etching, the grass stiff and bleached white, the skeletal trees stark black against a sky the color of faded slate. The scent of wood smoke from the manor's chimneys was stronger now, a welcome thread of warmth in the frigid air that greeted Eleanor as she descended to prepare for the day. The chrysalis hunt, a minor tremor in the bedrock of routine, loomed unexpectedly large in her mind. She found herself reviewing the textbook diagram of the Pieris brassicae * life cycle over her morning tea, the image of the hidden, transformative vessel feeling less like a scientific curiosity and more like a silent, potent symbol intruding upon her carefully ordered thoughts. Purpose, reorganization, flight, words that resonated with a dangerous, unfamiliar echo. When Nurse Briggs brought the children, bundled in thick cloaks and scarves against the cold, the atmosphere crackled with a different energy. Henry's usual contained watchfulness was replaced by a barely suppressed agitation, his eyes bright, his gloved hands fidgeting with the buttons of his coat. Even Amelia seemed less ethereal, a faint flush of anticipation, or perhaps just the cold, coloring her pale cheeks, her sketchbook clutched tightly under her arm. "Good morning, Miss Thorne," they chorused, their breath misting in the chilly schoolroom air, the formality tinged with an uncharacteristic eagerness. "Good morning," Eleanor responded, her voice maintaining its customary calm, though she felt an unwelcome flutter of something akin to stage fright. "We shall proceed directly to the kitchen garden for our observational exercise. Remember, Lady Amelia, detailed sketches of habitat and any specimens found. Lord Henry, keen observation of locations, sheltered walls, dense vegetation near host plants like nettles or cabbages. Nurse Briggs, you will ensure they remain within the designated area." She pulled her own shawl tighter, the decision feeling momentous as she led the small procession downstairs and through a side door leading to the walled kitchen garden. The frost had transformed the familiar rose into a glittering, silent tableau. The frosted cabbages resembled ghostly, oversized roses, the bean poles were hung with icy lace, the rosemary bushes were stiff sculptures dusted with diamond powder. The air was piercingly cold, utterly still, smelling of frozen earth and wood smoke. Henry needed no further instruction. He plunged towards the far wall where a tangle of nettles, now brown and brittle with frost, clung to the sheltered brickwork. Amelia followed more sedately, her eyes scanning the frosted ground and the rough stone surface, sketchbook open, pencil ready. Nurse Briggs stationed herself near the gate, a solid, watchful presence. Eleanor stood near a frosted herb bed, feeling strangely superfluous, an observer in her own experiment. The silence was profound, broken only by the crunch of frost underfoot and Henry's excited whispers to himself as he carefully parted frozen stalks with gloved hands, peering into crevices in the brickwork. "Look, Millie, look at this," he called out once, pointing to a cluster of tiny, frosted spheres clinging to a nettle stem, likely insect eggs, long dormant. Amelia dutifully sketched them, her pencil moving swiftly. Minutes stretched. The cold seeped through Eleanor's boots. Henry's initial fervor began to wane, replaced by frustrated muttering as frost-numbed fingers failed to find the hidden treasure. "Nothing but frost and dead things," he grumbled, kicking at a frozen clod of earth. Amelia had moved along the wall, her gaze methodical, her expression once more settling into its habitual detached calm. Eleanor felt a pang of disappointment, swiftly followed by relief. The diversion was ending naturally. Order would resume. She was about to call time when Amelia stopped abruptly. She didn't exclaim. She simply crouched down, her gray cloak pooling around her on the frosted ground, her attention fixed on a deep crevice where two sections of the old brick wall met, partially shielded by the frost-killed remains of a clematis vine. Her pencil hovered, then began to move with unusual intensity. Henry noticed her stillness and hurried over. "What is it? Did you find one?" His voice was a hoarse whisper. Amelia didn't answer immediately. She finished a few precise lines on her page, then pointed silently into the shadowed crevice. Henry crouched beside her, peering in. Eleanor, drawn by their focused silence, approached. Nestled deep within the angle of the bricks, sheltered from the worst of the frost, hung a small, angular object. It wasn't the smooth, jade-green chrysalis of the cabbage white depicted in their book. This was smaller, a rough, dull brownish gray, resembling a tiny, jagged piece of bark or a hardened droplet of mud, subtly pointed at one end. It clung tenaciously to the brick, utterly still, seemingly lifeless. "It's ugly," Henry breathed, his voice filled not with disgust, but with a kind of awe. "Is it alive? Is it changing in there?" Right now, he reached out a gloved finger, then pulled it back, as if afraid to touch the small, suspended mystery. "It is in diapause," Eleanor stated, the scientific term falling automatically from her lips. "A state of suspended development for winter. The transformation is paused, awaiting the warmth of spring." She crouched beside them, the cold of the ground biting through her skirts. Seeing the rough, unassuming object in its hidden crevice was profoundly different from the pinned butterfly or the textbook diagram. It was a tangible secret, a vessel of potential wrapped in drab obscurity, clinging to life through the killing frost. The words dissolution and reorganization felt suddenly visceral, heavy with meaning. Amelia finished her sketch, capturing the crevice, the frost-killed vine, and the small, cryptic shape with remarkable accuracy. She held the book out silently for Eleanor to see. It was a meticulous record, devoid of emotion, yet the very precision spoke volumes about the object's impact. "Can we leave it?" Henry asked, looking up at Eleanor, his blue eyes wide and serious. "So it can wake up in spring and fly." "Of course," Eleanor replied, the simplicity of the request disarming her. "That is its purpose, to endure the winter, to complete its change." She rose, brushing frost from her skirts, the cold now a deep ache in her bones. "Our time is concluded. Return indoors and warm yourselves. Lady Amelia, you may work on refining your sketch during your quiet hour. Lord Henry, you will write a brief account of the observation for your natural philosophy notes." They obeyed without complaint, Henry casting one last, lingering look at the hidden chrysalis before trudging back towards Nurse Briggs, his earlier frustration replaced by a thoughtful quiet. Amelia followed, clutching her sketchbook like a talisman. As Eleanor turned to follow, a movement caught her eye. High above, on the stone balcony overlooking the kitchen garden from the Duke's private study wing, a figure stood. Silhouetted against the gray sky, tall and still, the Duke watched them. How long had he been there? Observing the hunt for the hidden vessel of transformation. His face was in shadow, unreadable at this distance, but his posture was rigid, a dark sentinel against the winter sky. A jolt, cold and sharp as the frost, shot through Eleanor. Had he witnessed Henry's eager search, Amelia's intense focus, her own uncharacteristic crouch beside the children at the wall? The sense of his unseen eyes, assessing this small deviation, felt like a physical pressure. She quickly averted her gaze, walking briskly towards the door Nurse Briggs held open, the warmth from within rushing out in a welcoming cloud. The transition from the crystalline silence of the frozen garden to the familiar, beeswax and lavender scent of the manor corridor was jarring. The children's excited whispers to Nurse Briggs about the ugly little sleeping thing echoed strangely in the quiet hallway. Back in the schoolroom, the fire had been lit, casting a warm, deceptive glow. Henry set about his descriptive task with unusual concentration, his tongue poking out in fierce focus. Amelia refined her sketch, adding delicate cross-hatching to represent the rough texture of the chrysalis. Eleanor sat at her desk, attempting to review the afternoon's history lesson on the Wars of the Roses, but the words blurred. The image of the rough, brown chrysalis clinging to the cold brick superimposed itself over the text. And overlaid upon that, the stark silhouette of the Duke on the balcony, watching. Observing. Judging. Dinner that evening was charged with an undercurrent Eleanor couldn't ignore. The Duke's presence felt heavier, his silence more profound. When he finally spoke, his inquiry was not about lessons in general, but pointed. The observational exercise, Miss Thorne. Was it fruitful? Eleanor kept her gaze on her soup spoon. It was, Your Grace. Lady Amelia produced a detailed sketch of the habitat and specimen. Lord Henry located a chrysalis in diapause, likely that of a moth, given its form, and composed an adequate account of the find. The experience reinforced the textbook principles of insect life cycles and overwintering strategies. She delivered the report with clinical precision. The Duke nodded slowly, the firelight glinting in his dark eyes as he looked at her. Observation is indeed valuable, a reminder that life persists, even in stillness, even hidden. He paused, taking a sip of wine. Discipline, however, ensures that observation serves understanding, not distraction. His gaze lingered on her for a heartbeat longer than necessary before shifting to Mrs. Penhaligon, who mentioned the need to order more lamp oil. Discipline ensures observation serves understanding, not distraction. The words echoed in Eleanor's mind as she climbed the stairs later. Had the chrysalis hunt been understanding, or merely a distraction from the rigid path? And what had the Duke truly observed from his balcony? Her momentary immersion, the children's fleeting engagement with the raw, hidden processes of life. In her sitting room, the fire blazing now against the deep night cold, Eleanor took up the gray muffler. The needles felt clumsy in her fingers. The image of the chrysalis wouldn't leave her, its drab resilience, its suspended potential. In the Duke's silhouette, a dark counterpoint, a reminder of the unyielding structure that contained them all. She thought of Henry's awe, Amelia's intense focus. For a moment, the dust had been stirred, revealing not just a hidden insect pupa, but a glimpse of something else, a fragile curiosity, a yearning for connection to the world beyond grammar and fractions. But the Duke's words were the cold water on that spark. Discipline, not distraction. The chrysalis was safely hidden, dormant. Their purpose was clear, quiet application. Order, control. The profound boredom, deepened by the frost and the weight of unseen observation, settled back over her, thick and smothering. She pulled the gray wool tight, the needles clicking with renewed determination, a rhythmic incantation against the dangerous allure of transformation. The hunt was over. The specimen was noted. The routine reigned. The dust of discovery, momentarily illuminated by the winter sun and the Duke's watchful eye, began to settle once more, layer upon invisible layer, over the hidden chrysalis, over the children's subdued excitement, and over Eleanor's own flicker of unwelcome insight, burying it all beneath the vast, silent, frost-bound weight of Willow Creek Manor. Tomorrow would be French verbs. History, arithmetic. The chrysalis would sleep. They would endure. The geometry held. The needle moved. The silence deepened. Chapter 9. The calculus of snow and the dust of unspoken words. The frost held, deepening its crystalline grip on Willow Creek Manor. The world outside Eleanor's window remained locked in monochrome stillness, the sky a featureless sheet of pale gray that promised neither sun nor further snow, merely an unending, frigid suspension. The air inside, warmed by fires but unable to completely dispel the pervasive chill, carried the scent of wood smoke now mingled with the faint, camphorous tang of woolens brought out from storage. The chrysalis hunt, that brief, unsettling interlude in the frozen garden, had left its residue, a fine, persistent dust that seemed to settle not just on the furniture, but on the very atmosphere of the schoolroom. Henry, in the days that followed, exhibited a new kind of focus, a seriousness that sat oddly on his young features. His questions during natural philosophy were precise, aimed at understanding the mechanisms of hibernation or the structure of insect wings, delivered with an intensity that bordered on grim determination rather than wonder. He completed his arithmetic with fierce concentration, his messy figures now bearing the weight of his new resolve, as if mastering numbers was a key to unlocking other, hidden mysteries. Amelia, conversely, seemed to have retreated further. Her sketches of the chrysalis had been perfected, rendered with astonishing detail in her quiet hour, but she presented them without comment, her gaze drifting back to her internal landscapes during lessons, her stillness now tinged with a profound melancholy that the frost seemed to amplify. The Duke's silhouette on the balcony, his unseen observation, hung over Eleanor like the thread of ice on a laden branch. His words at dinner, discipline ensures observation serves understanding, not distraction, echoed in the quiet moments, a constant reminder of the boundaries she had momentarily brushed against. The profound boredom, always present, now felt charged, layered with this unspoken tension, the dust of discovery mingling with the dust of apprehension. Lessons resumed their rigid cadence. French verbs marched into the conditional mood, history chronicled the tutors with bloodless efficiency, geography mapped the rivers of Asia, a distant, unimaginable world. Eleanor taught with her customary precision, her voice a steady drone against the ticking clock and the soft scratch of pencils, yet her internal landscape felt subtly altered. The image of the rough, brown chrysalis clung to the cold brick, a symbol of suspended potential, intruded upon thoughts of declensions and equations. The Duke's watchful eyes, imagined now in the shadowed corners of the room during lessons, added a layer of invisible scrutiny. She found herself observing the children with a new intensity, not just for lapses in discipline, but for signs of the curiosity she had inadvertently sparked, or signs of the suppression the Duke demanded. Henry's intense focus felt brittle, Amelia's withdrawal, deeper. It was a calculus she couldn't solve, variables shifting beneath the surface of enforced calm. Days blurred into a pattern of chill mornings, gray afternoons, and silent evenings. The promised snow finally arrived one night, not with a blizzard's fury, but as a silent, relentless descent of large, wet flakes that began after midnight and continued unabated through the pre-dawn hours. Eleanor awoke to a transformed world. The monochrome etching of frost had been replaced by a thick, muffling blanket of white, softening every harsh line, rounding every edge, reducing the parkland to a series of gentle, undulating drifts and transforming the skeletal trees into ghostly sculptures draped in lace. The silence outside was absolute, profound, deeper than any before, broken only by the occasional soft thump of snow sliding from an overloaded branch. The manor itself seemed to huddle deeper into itself, the fires burning brighter against the cold leaching through the thick stone walls. The snow necessitated adjustments. The children's outdoor hour was cancelled, the stable yard activity ceased, the world beyond the gates vanished beneath the white shroud. Confinement pressed inwards. The schoolroom felt smaller, the air thicker with the scent of wet wool drying by the hearth and the faint, metallic tang of the snow melt tracked in on boots. Henry chafed visibly at the restriction, his newfound focus frayed at the edges, replaced by a restless energy that manifested in constant, small movements, tapping his foot, drumming fingers on the desk, sighing heavily during Latin translations. Amelia seemed to shrink further into herself, her gaze fixed not on the winter wonderland outside, but on the intricate grain of her desk wood. Eleanor maintained the routine with iron determination. Arithmetic, French, history, the familiar structure was the only bulwark against the claustrophobic stillness amplified by the snow. She assigned extra drawing exercises, intricate geometric patterns for Henry, requiring intense concentration, detailed studies of winter bare branches in a vase for Amelia. The scratch of pencils became the dominant sound, a desperate counterpoint to the encompassing silence. Lunch was eaten in near silence, the usual clink of cutlery sounding unnaturally loud. The afternoon stretched, interminable. Eleanor, feeling the pressure of the confined space and Henry's mounting restlessness, finally set aside the planned geography. "We will devote this hour to reading aloud," she announced, selecting a volume of improving, morally unambiguous fables from the shelf. "Lady Amelia, you may begin." Amelia read in her soft, precise voice, the tale of the industrious ant and the lazy grasshopper rendered with flawless enunciation but utterly devoid of inflection, a recitation as cold as the snow outside. Henry fidgeted, his gaze darting to the window. When Amelia finished, Eleanor turned to him. "Lord Henry, your turn. The Fox and the Grapes." Henry took the book, his movements stiff. He began haltingly, his voice flat. He stumbled over words, his frustration mounting with each error. And the fox, unable to reach the luscious, luscious grapes, he slammed the book shut suddenly, the sound shockingly loud in the quiet room. "It's stupid," he burst out, his voice cracking, the pent-up energy of confinement and suppressed feeling finally erupting. "The fox is just stupid and sour. Why doesn't he just find a stick, or climb, or anything except just give up and say they're sour?" He glared at the closed book as if it were personally responsible for the snow, the confinement, the entire oppressive weight of Willow Creek. Amelia flinched, drawing back. Eleanor felt the familiar cold mantle of control descend, but beneath it surged a complex wave, exhaustion, a flicker of agreement with Henry's raw assessment of the fable's futility, and the crushing awareness of the Duke's unseen judgment. This was the distraction he had warned against. This was the undisciplined energy that threatened the order. She did not shout. She simply looked at Henry, her gaze steady, implacable, holding his turbulent blue eyes. The silence, deepened by the snow's muffling blanket, became a physical force. Henry's defiance wilted under that silent pressure, replaced by a familiar flush of shame. He looked down at the offending book. "Composure, Lord Henry," Eleanor stated, her voice low but cutting through the quiet like steel. "Open the book. Begin again. From the beginning." His shoulders slumped. He opened the book with trembling fingers. His voice, when he resumed, was a dull, defeated monotone, devoid of any spark, any question. He finished the fable without further interruption, the moral delivered like a sentence. The rest of the hour passed in crushing silence. When Nurse Briggs arrived, the relief in the room was palpable. Henry handed her his cloak without meeting anyone's eyes. Amelia followed, her own gaze distant. Eleanor tidied the schoolroom, the act mechanical. The snow continued to fall, thick and silent, sealing them in. Dinner that evening was a study in heightened tension. The Duke inquired about the day. Reading aloud was the principal afternoon activity. "Your Grace," Eleanor reported, her voice devoid of inflection. Lady Amelia read with clarity. Lord Henry experienced a lapse in composure during his recitation, which was corrected. She omitted the content of his outburst, the critique of the fable. The Duke's gaze rested on her, then flickered towards the snow-heavy windows. "Confinement breeds restlessness," he stated, his voice neutral. "Discipline must be its counterweight. Well contained, Miss Thorne." The praise, again, felt like ice. "Thank you, Your Grace." Mrs. Penhaligon discussed the challenges the snow posed for the coal delivery. Eleanor ate her stewed pears, tasting only ash. Later, in her sitting room, the fire roaring against the blizzard's muffled howl outside, Eleanor took up the gray muffler. The needles felt leaden. Henry's outburst replayed, not the anger, but the raw, undeniable truth in his frustration with the fox's passive acceptance. Why doesn't he just find a stick? Or climb? The question resonated with the image of the chrysalis, clinging, waiting, enduring. Was enduring enough? Was passive acceptance the highest virtue at Willow Creek? The Duke's silhouette on the balcony superimposed itself over the scene. His discipline demanded stillness, suppression, understanding without engagement, observation without distraction. But Henry's spirit, Amelia's retreating soul, her own flicker of unwelcome insight, these were the distractions. The snow fell, burying the world, burying the rough chrysalis on the wall, burying Henry's cry against futility. Eleanor pulled the gray wool tight, the needles clicking with a desperate rhythm. Purpose. The chrysalis had purpose, flight, procreation. What was theirs? To endure the winter, to master French verbs, to remain perfectly, silently contained. The profound boredom, deepened by the snow and the weight of unspoken words and suppressed spirits, settled over her, thick and suffocating as the drifts outside. The hunt for the chrysalis felt like a dangerous dream. The dust of discovery was buried now, deep beneath layers of snow and silence and the Duke's implacable discipline. Tomorrow would be French verbs, history, arithmetic. The snow might stop, but the confinement within the manor's walls, within the rigid geometry of their lives, remained. The needle moved. The muffler grew. The silence, absolute and unyielding, pressed in, a vast, white shroud over the hidden turmoil within the chrysalis of Willow Creek Manor. Endurance was the only calculation that mattered. The dust of rebellion settled, frozen in place. Chapter 10, The Thaw of Handkerchiefs and the Dust of Shifting Light. The snow held Willow Creek in its frozen grip for 3 interminable days, a silent, smothering presence that turned the manor into an isolated island of ticking clocks and muffled footsteps. The world beyond the windows existed only as a blur of white through ice-fringed glass, the parkland's contours smoothed into anonymous drifts, the skeletal trees bowed under burdens of snow that occasionally slid to the ground with soft, startling thuds in the profound stillness. Confinement pressed inward, thickening the air in the schoolroom with the scent of damp wool drying by the hearth, chalk dust, and an almost palpable restlessness emanating from Henry like heat from a banked fire. His post-chrysalis focus had shattered under the enforced imprisonment, replaced by a jittery energy that manifested in constant, small transgressions. His foot tapped a relentless rhythm against his desk leg, his slate pencil snapped with alarming frequency, his sighs during Latin translations were theatrical groans of despair. Amelia retreated further into her shell of stillness, her gaze fixed on the intricate frost patterns on the window panes as if deciphering cryptic messages from the frozen world, her responses during lessons delivered in monosyllables, her sketchbook lying untouched. Eleanor maintained the fortress of routine with grim determination, the rigid schedule of arithmetic, French, history, and geography the only bulwark against the encroaching chaos of confinement and Henry's simmering frustration. Reading aloud sessions became exercises in teeth-gritting endurance, Henry stumbling over words with deliberate clumsiness, his voice dripping with sullen resentment, while Amelia's flawless recitations sounded like pronouncements from a tomb. Luncheons were eaten in a brittle silence broken only by the clatter of cutlery, the tension thickening with each snow-locked day. The profound boredom, always present, curdled into a kind of desperate inertia, the dust of their existence feeling heavier, more suffocating beneath the white shroud. Even dinner in the small dining room felt strained. The Duke's inquiries about progress were met with Eleanor's increasingly terse reports of challenges due to confinement, and efforts to maintain focus, while Mrs. Penhaligon's household updates, dwindling coal supplies, a frozen pipe in the scullery, underscored their isolation. The Duke himself seemed more remote, his gaze often distant, fixed on the snow-blurred windows or the flickering flames in the grate, his responses minimal, adding to the sense of suspended animation, of life reduced to its barest, coldest functions. The thaw began on the fourth morning, not with a dramatic surge of warmth, but with a subtle softening of the relentless cold, the iron-hard grip of the frost loosened, replaced by a damp, penetrating chill that carried the scent of wet stone and decaying snow. Eleanor awoke to the unfamiliar sound of dripping water, a steady plink 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 from the eaves outside her window. Looking out, she saw the world still white, but the snow now bore a dull, granular look, the drifts slumped and settling, dark patches of wet earth beginning to show through where the weak sun, struggling through thinning cloud, touched the south-facing walls. Rivulets of meltwater traced dark paths down the glass panes. The transformation was slow, incremental, but undeniable. Life, sluggish and cold, was returning. The effect on the schoolroom was immediate, though subtle. Henry, sensing the shift, became marginally less feral, his restlessness tempered by a watchful anticipation. He still fidgeted, still sighed dramatically over Caesar's Gallic campaigns, but the edge of despair had lifted. Amelia remained withdrawn, but her gaze shifted from the frost patterns to the trails of water on the windows, following their meandering paths with detached interest. Eleanor felt the oppressive weight of confinement begin to lift from her own shoulders, replaced by the damp chill of the thaw and a cautious relief. Lessons proceeded with a fraction less resistance. The rigid geometry of their days held, but the angles felt slightly less sharp, the lines blurred by the pervasive damp and the promise of release. It was during one such lesson, a particularly dry exposition on the tributaries of the river Ganges, that Eleanor felt a familiar, unwelcome tickle at the back of her throat. She paused mid-sentence, turning slightly away from the children, raising a hand instinctively to her lips as a small, dry cough escaped her. It was nothing, merely the lingering chill in the air, the dust stirred by the thaw. She cleared her throat quietly, intending to resume. But another cough followed, sharper this time, catching her unprepared. She fumbled instinctively for the handkerchief tucked into her sleeve, the plain, white one she had edged herself weeks ago, a small, practical square of linen. Bringing it to her lips, she stifled the next cough, feeling the slight tremor in her hand. The silence in the room was absolute. Both children were staring at her, Henry with open curiosity, Amelia with that unnerving, watchful stillness. Eleanor lowered the handkerchief, smoothing it quickly, her cheeks warming with a flush she sternly attributed to the coughing fit. "Apologies," she murmured, her voice slightly husky. "Please continue tracing the course of the Yamuna River, Lord Henry." She turned back to the map, avoiding their gaze, the small square of linen clutched tightly in her hand feeling suddenly conspicuous, a breach in her usual, unruffled composure. Dinner that evening held a peculiar tension. The dripping eaves provided a constant, liquid counterpoint to the usual silence. The Duke inquired, as usual, about the day. Eleanor reported on geography and arithmetic, mentioning Henry's improved application now the thaw was underway, omitting her own minor indisposition. As the footman cleared the main course and presented a dish of baked apples, a slight, almost imperceptible movement caught Eleanor's eye. The Duke, reaching for his wineglass, paused. His hand, usually so assured, hovered for a fraction of a second before he smoothly completed the motion. But Eleanor's gaze, sharpened by her own recent lapse, had dropped to the crisp white linen at his wrist. Nestled beside his cufflink, its edge just visible, was a handkerchief. Not the plain, serviceable white she expected, but one of finest, snow-white cambric, exquisitely monogrammed in one corner with a subtle, intricate A in dark blue thread. It was a detail of such refined elegance, so utterly at odds with the Duke's usual austere practicality, that it struck her like a physical thing. It spoke of a world beyond Willow Creek's rigid discipline, a world of personal luxury, perhaps even vanity, carefully hidden beneath the sober wool and starched linen. She quickly averted her eyes, focusing intently on her dessert spoon, but the image was seared into her mind, the delicate monogram, the whisper of extravagance concealed at his wrist. It felt like discovering a secret compartment in a stern, unadorned box. Mrs. Penhaligon mentioned the coal delivery had finally arrived, the cart managing the partially cleared drive. The Duke acknowledged this with a curt nod, his gaze sweeping over the table, passing over Eleanor without apparent notice. But she felt exposed, as if her brief moment of weakness, her clutching of her plain handkerchief, had somehow resonated with the revelation of his concealed finery. The handkerchief, hers simple and functional, his monogrammed and hidden, became symbols in the quiet room, emblems of the private selves carefully masked by the roles they played, the disciplined governess, the remote duke. The dripping water outside seemed to mock the stillness within, a reminder of thaw, of slow, inevitable change, of things hidden beginning to seep through the cracks in the ice. Later, in her sitting room, the fire struggling against the damp chill that had replaced the dry cold, Eleanor took up her gray muffler. But the needles felt clumsy. Her mind wouldn't settle on the rhythmic click. Instead, it replayed the cough, the fumble. For her handkerchief, the children's stares, and then, vividly, the glimpse of the Duke's monogrammed linen. That small, hidden flourish of elegance felt like a seismic shift in the landscape of her understanding. It hinted at layers beneath the stern exterior, at a life, or a taste, existing before Willow Creek's pervasive quiet, carefully compartmentalized but not entirely extinguished. Was it a relic, a stubborn habit, or a silent rebellion against the gray monotony he himself enforced? The profound boredom that had defined her existence here suddenly felt different. It wasn't just absence, it was a constructed thing, a deliberate suppression, a blanket thrown over, what? Over his own hidden monograms. Over Henry's stifled energy, over Amelia's drifting spirit, over her own buried flickers of unwelcome thought. The thaw outside was revealing the mud beneath the snow, the messy reality beneath the pristine white surface. Was something similar happening within the manor's thick walls? The drip 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 of the melting snow echoed the insistent ticking of the clock, both measuring time, but the dripping spoke of change, of erosion, of hidden things returning to the light. She looked down at the gray wool in her hands, the muffler half finished, a barrier against the cold. But the cold felt different now. Less pure, less absolute. Tinged with damp, with the promise of mud, with the unsettling dust of revelations, both her own vulnerability and the Duke's concealed elegance. The geometry of Willow Creek still held, the lines of duty and discipline still defined her days. But the light was shifting, the angles casting different shadows, the dust motes dancing in unfamiliar patterns stirred by the thawing world outside and the unsettling glimpse of a monogrammed secret within. The needle hesitated, then resumed its clicking, a quieter, more uncertain rhythm against the backdrop of dripping water and the vast, echoing silence of the house, a silence that no longer felt entirely empty, but pregnant with the damp, heavy promise of things long buried beginning, slowly, inevitably, to surface. Chapter 11, The Calculus of Mud and the Dust of Unraveling Threads. The thaw accelerated with a damp, insistent persistence, transforming the pristine white shroud into a patchwork of slush and mud. The once silent parkland echoed with the constant drip 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 of melting snow from branches and eaves, the gurgle of unseen water coursing beneath softening drifts, and the occasional wet, slumping sound as another section of snow surrendered to the weak, watery sunlight that now struggled through the thinning cloud cover. The air inside Willow Creek Manor lost its biting edge, replaced by a pervasive, clammy chill that carried the scent of wet wool, damp stone, and the earthy tang of thawing ground seeping through every crevice. The pristine geometry of winter dissolved into messy, unpredictable liquidity. Paths became treacherous morasses of churned mud by servants and the occasional venture outdoors. The stable yard was a quagmire, even the kitchen garden walls wept dark streaks down their frosted brick. The profound boredom of deep winter curdled into a different beast, a restless, damp inertia, a sense of waiting for the mud to solidify, for the world to regain its definable edges. Eleanor felt this shift acutely. The rigid structure of lessons, French verbs wrestling with the subjunctive mood, history dissecting the Elizabethan religious settlement, arithmetic navigating decimals, remained her anchor, but the schoolroom air felt thicker, charged with the damp and with Henry's resurgent, mud-stained energy. His confinement-induced lethargy vanished with the snow. He bounced into the room with boots tracking faint smears of earth nurse. Briggs hadn't entirely removed, his eyes bright, his questions about geography suddenly voluble and tinged with a practical curiosity about where all the meltwater went. Amelia remained an island of stillness, but her gaze followed the rivulets on the windowpanes with a new intensity, her fingers occasionally tracing similar, invisible paths on the surface of her desk. The glimpse of the Duke's monogrammed handkerchief, that small, hidden flourish of incongruous elegance, lingered in Eleanor's mind like a persistent watermark on her thoughts, subtly distorting her perception of the stern, disciplined man across the dinner table. It whispered of secrets, of a life or tastes carefully compartmentalized beneath the gray wool of Willow Creek. Her own brief lapse, the cough and the fumble for her plain handkerchief, felt amplified in retrospect, a crack in her own carefully maintained composure the children had witnessed. She found herself hyper-aware of her movements, her voice, striving for an even greater precision, a more absolute control, as if to plaster over that momentary vulnerability and the unsettling questions raised by the Duke's hidden, The return of the children's outdoor hour, though now conducted on sodden ground under a weeping sky, was a necessary release. Eleanor watched from the schoolroom window as Henry immediately plunged into the less muddy margins of the stable yard, poking sticks into puddles, examining the dark, saturated earth with intense curiosity, his earlier question about water flow evidently driving him to investigate its effects firsthand. Amelia, bundled in her cloak, didn't retreat to her bench. Instead, she walked slowly along the edge of the kitchen garden, her eyes scanning the thawing earth near the walls, perhaps seeking signs of the chrysalis beneath its slushy blanket, or simply observing the small eruptions of life, a brave earthworm venturing onto the surface, the first tips of snowdrops pushing through the dark, wet soil. Her stillness wasn't vacant now, it was focused, observational. Eleanor noted it, filing it away with a mixture of unease and a faint, unwelcome echo of her own concession to Henry's curiosity weeks before. Later, during drawing, Henry, still energized, abandoned his geometric shapes without permission. Instead of cubes, a chaotic, vigorous scene emerged on his slate: slushy paths, dark, dripping trees, a small figure, himself, poking a stick into a huge puddle sending out muddy spray. It was messy, inaccurate, but vibrantly alive in a way his previous constrained efforts never were. "Lord Henry," Eleanor said, her voice cool, "the exercise was geometric forms." "This is irrelevant." Henry looked up, his face flushed, the spark of creation dimming instantly under her reproof. "But, the mud, Miss Thorne. It's everywhere now, and the water's moving." His protest held the ghost of his old frustration. The assignment, Eleanor reiterated firmly, was geometric precision. "Begin again." A cue. The spark died. He picked up his slate rag, erased the lively mess with rough, angry strokes, and began drawing stiff, lifeless lines. Amelia, meanwhile, presented her work, a single, meticulously rendered snowdrop, its white petals stark against the dark, wet earth sheet shaded with astonishing detail, capturing the texture of the thawing ground perfectly. It was beautiful, precise, and utterly melancholic. Eleanor accepted both slates, Henry's rigid cube, Amelia's perfect flower of decay, the contrast a stark illustration of the forces at play within the manor's walls, suppression versus detached observation, messy vitality versus sterile beauty. The dust of discovery, stirred by the chrysalis in the thaw, felt like it was settling into uncomfortable patterns. Dinner, that evening, was charged with the damp chill and the unspoken weight of observation. The dripping eaves were a constant percussion. The Duke inquired about the children's adaptation to the thaw. "Lord Henry displays renewed energy, Your Grace," Eleanor reported, choosing her words with surgical care, though requiring continued guidance towards focused application. Lady Amelia observes the changes in the grounds with quiet attention. She omitted the muddy drawing, the snowdrop. The Duke nodded, his gaze distant for a moment, perhaps listening to the drip of water outside. "Change is inevitable," he stated, his voice devoid of inflection. "Discipline provides the constant." His hand rested on the table near his wineglass. Eleanor's gaze, drawn magnetically, flickered to his cuff. The crisp white linen was visible, but the monogrammed handkerchief remained hidden, tucked away, a secret preserved. The absence felt deliberate, a reinforcement of boundaries. Mrs. Penhaligon discussed the difficulties the mud posed for the laundress. Eleanor murmured agreement, the taste of her poached trout ashen in her mouth. Later, in her sitting room, the fire battling the damp, Eleanor took up the gray muffler. But her fingers, usually so sure, fumbled. The wool snagged. She dropped a stitch. A small, loose loop stared up at her from the otherwise perfect, monotonous rows. It was a tiny flaw, insignificant, yet it felt like a catastrophe. A physical manifestation of the unraveling she felt within. The cough, the handkerchief, Henry's messy vitality, Amelia's melancholic precision, the Duke's hidden monogram, the relentless drip 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 of the thaw. They were all threads pulling, loosening the tight weave of her control. She stared at the dropped stitch, the gray wool a tangle in her lap. Fixing it would be simple, a matter of hooking the loop back with a needle. But the effort felt immense. The profound boredom was gone, replaced by a damp, anxious tension, a sense of standing on ground that was no longer solid ice but treacherous, shifting mud. The rigid geometry of Willow Creek was blurring, its straight lines warped by the thaw, by hidden elegance, by suppressed curiosity, by the sheer, muddy insistence of life reasserting itself. The dust wasn't settling, it was swirling, agitated by the meltwater, revealing uncomfortable truths beneath the frozen surface. She looked at the dropped stitch, a tiny snag in the fabric of her carefully constructed monotony. Outside, the dripping water continued its patient, relentless work. The needle lay heavy in her hand. The muffler, half finished, felt less like a barrier against the cold and more like a shroud she was weaving for herself, stitch by gray, unraveling stitch, within the damp, whispering chrysalis of the thawing manor. The silence remained, but it was no longer empty, it was filled with the sound of melting, of dripping, of small, persistent things coming unstuck. Chapter 12, The Algebra of Blossoms and the Dust of Unanswered Gestures. The relentless thaw surrendered to a tentative, watery spring. The mud remained, a churned brown testament to the season's messy transition, but now punctuated by improbable eruptions of color. Clusters of defiantly cheerful crocuses piercing the wet earth near the kitchen door, the pale yellow stars of primroses huddled in sheltered corners, and the first, tightly furled buds appearing on the otherwise bare branches of the pear tree in the south garden. The air, still cool and damp, carried new scents layered over the persistent wood smoke and wet wool. The faint, green promise of awakening grass, the clean sharpness of daffodil stems, and the subtle, honeyed perfume of the precocious blooms. The dripping eaves slowed, replaced by the busy chirruping of returning sparrows and the occasional, hesitant song of a robin. Willow Creek Manor seemed to exhale, its stone walls absorbing the weak sunlight, the profound, frozen silence of winter giving way to a softer, more diffuse quiet filled with the small, hopeful sounds of renewal. Yet within the schoolroom, the atmosphere felt suspended between seasons. Henry, energized by the retreating mud and the burgeoning life outside, brought traces of the awakening world in on his boots, a smear of bright yellow pollen, a tiny, perfect snail shell discovered and presented with breathless excitement before being gently confiscated by Nurse Briggs. His questions during natural philosophy shifted from overwintering to germination, from chrysalides to caterpillars, delivered with an eager intensity that bordered on overwhelming. Amelia observed the changes with quiet absorption, her sketches now featuring the delicate structure of crocus petals or the intricate veining of an early leaf, rendered with her customary precision but imbued with a new, subtle warmth, a hint of life absent from her winter chrysalis study. Eleanor, attempting to navigate this shift while maintaining the fortress of routine, felt like she was walking on thawing ground. French verbs felt absurdly abstract against the vibrant reality unfurling beyond the window. The wars of the roses paled beside the drama of a bud unfurling. Her own internal landscape mirrored the external thaw, the rigid ice of discipline softening into a treacherous mud of unwelcome questions and unsettling observations. The Duke's hidden monogram, that small, elegant A, haunted her perception of him. Was it a relic of a lost wife? A mother's gift? A personal indulgence fiercely guarded? It whispered of a past, a personality, meticulously buried beneath the mantle of ducal authority. Her own fumble with her handkerchief felt like a mirrored vulnerability, a crack in her governess armor that children had glimpsed. She compensated with heightened rigidity, her voice during lessons a flatter monotone, her corrections delivered with sharper precision, her gaze avoiding the window where spring beckoned with irresponsible allure. She assigned complex algebraic equations to Henry, requiring intense focus to dampen his exuberance, and intricate embroidery patterns to Amelia, demanding microscopic attention to detail. The scratch of Henry's pencil wrestling with X and Y, the whisper of Amelia's needle through linen, became the soundtrack of their resistance to the season's call. One afternoon, the sunlight unexpectedly strong, pouring through the tall windows and illuminating the dust motes like gold filings in the air, Eleanor felt the familiar tickle at the back of her throat return. It was more insistent this time, a dry rasp that demanded acknowledgement. She turned sharply away from the blackboard where she'd been diagramming a sentence, raising her hand to her lips as a series of dry, hacking coughs seized her. It was worse than before, bending her slightly at the waist, her eyes watering. Instinctively, she fumbled in her sleeve for her plain handkerchief, bringing it to her mouth. When the fit subsided, she straightened, composing herself with an effort, the small square of linen clutched tightly. Both children were staring, Henry with open concern wrinkling his brow, Amelia with that deep, unnerving stillness. "Apologies," Eleanor managed, her voice rough. "Please continue parsing the subordinate clause." She turned back to the board, her cheeks burning, the handkerchief a damp, crumpled weight in her hand. The incident felt like a defeat, a public unraveling of her carefully maintained control. Dinner that evening arrived with the lingering warmth of the day still clinging to the stone corridors. The dripping had ceased entirely, replaced by the distant chirping of crickets testing the evening air. The conversation was sparse, focused on estate matters. Lambing had begun in the high meadows, requiring extra shepherds. The Duke seemed marginally less remote, perhaps softened by the seasonal shift, or simply attending to the practicalities of spring. As the footman served a delicate asparagus soup, Eleanor felt another cough building, a deep, involuntary spasm. She fought it, pressing her lips together, her eyes watering, but it burst forth, harsh and sudden in the quiet room. She raised her plain handkerchief swiftly, muffling the sound, her shoulders shaking slightly. When she lowered it, dabbing at her watering eyes, she felt the weight of attention. Mrs. Penhaligon's expression held polite concern. The Duke's gaze was fixed upon her, not with his usual impersonal assessment, but with a sharp, focused intensity she hadn't encountered before. It wasn't disapproval, nor sympathy, it was pure, unsettling observation. Then, with a movement so swift and fluid it seemed almost unconscious, his hand went to the breast pocket of his waistcoat. He withdrew not the expected plain white square, but the handkerchief, the fine cambric, the intricate blue, stark against the snowy linen in the candlelight. He didn't offer it, he didn't unfold it, he simply held it, poised in his long fingers for a fleeting moment, his dark eyes locked on Eleanor's flushed face, on the simple, crumpled square she still clutched. It was a gesture devoid of practical purpose, yet charged with meaning, an acknowledgement, a display, a silent question hanging in the suddenly electric air. He saw her lapse, her vulnerability mirrored in the plain linen, and he responded by revealing his own hidden token, his concealed elegance, holding it like a counterpoint, a shared secret laid bare between them for that suspended second. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the moment passed. He smoothly returned the monogrammed handkerchief to his pocket, his expression reverting to its usual impassive mask as he picked up his soup spoon. "The asparagus is particularly fine this year," he remarked to Mrs. Penhaligon, his voice calm, as if the charged exchange had never happened. Eleanor sat frozen, the taste of the soup ashes in her mouth, her own plain handkerchief suddenly feeling like a badge of shameful inadequacy clutched in her trembling hand. The algebra of blossoms outside, the simple, joyous equation of spring, felt impossibly distant, replaced by the complex, unsolvable calculus of that silent gesture, the revelation of the unspoken question in his eyes, the swift retreat behind the ducal facade. The dust of discovery wasn't settling, it was swirling in a vortex around that single, monogrammed square of cambric, revealing not answers, but deeper, more unsettling mysteries within the heart of Willow Creek Manor. The profound boredom was irrevocably shattered, replaced by a damp, anxious tension thick with the scent of asparagus soup, wood smoke, and the faint, lingering trace of expensive linen. The needle lay forgotten, the muffler unfinished. The geometry was fractured, the lines blurred beyond repair by a glimpse of hidden embroidery and the echo of a cough in the quiet room. Spring had arrived, bringing not renewal, but the unsettling unraveling of carefully woven silence. Chapter 13, The Calculus of Cambric and the Dust of Unspoken Truths. The revelation hung in the air of the small dining room long after the Duke had smoothly returned his monogrammed handkerchief to its hidden pocket and redirected the conversation to the asparagus. The taste of the soup turned to ashes on Eleanor's tongue, the delicate flavor obliterated by the shock of that silent, deliberate gesture, the unveiling of the stark elegance held aloft for that breathless second solely for her witness, a counterpoint to her own crumpled plainness clutched in her damp hand. It was an accusation, a challenge, a shared secret laid bare with terrifying intimacy in the flickering candlelight. The rest of the meal passed in a blur of clinking cutlery and Mrs. Penhaligon's measured observations about the lambing, Eleanor responding on autopilot, her cheeks burning, her gaze fixed firmly on her plate, acutely aware of the Duke's presence radiating a new, unnerving intensity across the table. He didn't look at her again, but the weight of his unspoken question, "What do you make of this? What do you see?" pressed upon her like the damp spring air. Later, Climbing the stairs to her rooms, the silence of the manor felt different, charged, pregnant with the echo of that cambric square in her own rasping cough. In her sitting room, she didn't light the lamp immediately. Moonlight, pale and cool, filtered through the window, illuminating the half-finished gray muffler abandoned on the armchair. She picked it up, the dropped stitch a stark imperfection in the monotonous rows, a tangible echo of her unraveling composure. The profound, numbing boredom that had once been her refuge was irrevocably shattered. In its place swirled a turbulent mix of confusion, a flicker of forbidden curiosity about the man behind the ducal mask, and a deep, unsettling shame at her vulnerability witnessed, shame at the stark contrast between her plain utility and his hidden luxury. She thought of the chrysalis, rough and dormant. Was the Duke, too, encased in some invisible chrysalis of his own making? And what monstrous or beautiful thing might emerge if it ever broke? Sleep was elusive, fractured by images of monogrammed linen flashing in candlelight and the phantom sensation of dust catching in her throat. The next morning dawned bright, the spring sun stronger, gilding the wet grass and making the remaining daffodils blaze like miniature suns. Eleanor dressed with meticulous care, pinning her hair severely, choosing her plainest gray dress, armoring herself in routine. The schoolroom felt like a battleground. Henry bounded in, buzzing with news of a newborn lamb he'd glimpsed from a distance, his energy a stark contrast to Eleanor's brittle calm. Amelia entered more quietly, her gray eyes sweeping over Eleanor with a perceptiveness that felt unsettling, as if she sensed the seismic shift beneath the governess's rigid exterior. Lessons commenced. French subjunctives, a torture of hypotheticals that felt cruelly apt. Henry stumbled, distracted by the world outside. Amelia parsed flawlessly, but her gaze occasionally drifted to Eleanor, lingering on her throat as if expecting another cough. Eleanor taught with a brittle precision, her voice tighter, flatter, every correction delivered with a sharpness that made Henry flinch and Amelia's expression grow more opaque. The algebra problems she said were fiendishly complex, a desperate attempt to impose order on the chaos within. During a brief lull while Amelia transcribed a history passage, Henry, emboldened perhaps by the sunshine or the lingering memory of the Duke's unexpected gesture towards Eleanor, had he sensed it, piped up. "Miss Thorne, did you see the Duke's handkerchief last night? The one with the fancy blue letter? It looked ever so fine. Much finer than—" He trailed off, suddenly aware of his overstep, his eyes widening as Eleanor turned a gaze upon him that could have frozen the new spring growth outside. "Personal possessions are not a subject for discussion, Lord Henry," she stated, her voice like ice cracking. "Focus on your quadratic equations." The rebuke was swift, harsh, silencing Henry instantly, his face flushing crimson as he bent over his slate. But the damage was done. The secret was named, dragged into the schoolroom's dusty light. Amelia didn't look up, but her pencil paused for a fraction of a second. The air thickened, heavy with unspoken thoughts about hidden elegance and governesses who coughed. Eleanor avoided the small dining room that evening, pleading a lingering headache, not entirely untrue, a band of tension tightening around her temples. A tray was brought to her sitting room, clear broth, dry toast. She picked at it, the food tasteless. The muffler lay untouched. Instead, driven by a restless, inexplicable urge, she opened her workbasket. Beneath skeins of gray wool lay her own secret stash, small squares of finer linen than she usually used, salvaged from an old petticoat. She rarely used them, finding the smooth texture almost decadent. Tonight, however, she selected one. She threaded a needle not with serviceable gray, but with a strand of deep indigo silk, another small, hidden luxury purchased years ago in a moment of weakness and never used. Her hands trembled slightly. She didn't plan a pattern. Instead, driven by the turmoil within, she began to stitch. Not the neat, geometric borders she usually favored. This was different, fluid, organic. A single, sinuous line emerged, twisting and turning like a vine, or perhaps a river, rendered in the rich blue silk against the pale linen. It was a small rebellion, a silent scream of color and form against the gray monotony. She stitched with fierce concentration, the needle flashing in the lamplight, the indigo thread a vibrant accusation against the drab world of Willow Creek. She stitched the Duke's hidden, the children's watchful eyes, her own suffocating shame, the relentless drip of thaw giving way to birdsong, the rough chrysalis waiting, the terrifying, exhilarating glimpse of something beyond discipline. The vine river grew, filling the corner of the handkerchief, a secret manifesto in silk. A few days later, needing a specific reference volume on Tudor economic policy shelved in the Duke's study, a room she hadn't entered since her initial interview, Eleanor found herself standing before its heavy oak door, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She knocked, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet corridor. A curt, "Enter," came from within. Pushing the door open, the familiar scent of old leather, paper, and beeswax enveloped her. The Duke sat behind his massive desk, silhouetted against the window overlooking the now vibrant green parkland. He looked up, his expression unreadable. "Miss Thorne, Your Grace," she murmured, dropping a curtsy. "I require Chambers' treatise on Tudor taxation, if I may. It is not in the schoolroom library." He gestured wordlessly towards a section of shelves. As she moved towards them, her gaze, inevitably, swept the room. And then she saw it, not tucked away, but placed deliberately, almost prominently, on a small, polished side table near the window, a lacquered box, its lid open. Inside, neatly folded, lay not one, but perhaps a dozen handkerchiefs. All of the same exquisite cambric, all monogrammed with the same intricate, dark blue, A. They lay there like a display, an open secret, a deliberate provocation. Had he placed them there after the dining room incident? Was this a challenge, a confession, or simply the removal of the secret's power by making it visible? Eleanor froze, her breath catching not from a cough, but from sheer shock. The vibrant indigo vine she'd embroidered on her hidden handkerchief seemed to burn against her skin beneath her sleeve. The Duke watched her, his dark eyes noting her arrested movement, her gaze fixed on the open box. He said nothing. The silence stretched, thick with the dust of centuries and the weight of 100 unspoken questions about hidden selves, monogrammed linen, and the terrifying, fragile possibility that the chrysalis walls of Willow Creek Manor might not hold forever against the insistent pressure of spring, curiosity, and the quiet, desperate embroidery of a governess's soul. The algebra of their existence had acquired too many variables. The cough, the children's watchfulness, the indigo vine, the open box. The solution felt terrifyingly out of reach. She grabbed the heavy taxation volume blindly, mumbled thanks, and fled the room, the image of those neatly folded squares of cambric burning behind her eyes, a silent testament to a mystery deepening with every stolen glance and every stitch of rebellious silk. The dust wasn't settling, it was coalescing, forming shapes of hidden lives and unspoken desires within the sun-dappled quiet of the Duke's study.